Earlier, a light wind swayed the trees and lifted leaves torn from their branches. Birds rose into the sky, and in the quiet the main character realized he wanted to live a carefree life. Leisure is important to a man, and he has always valued it. Always use 60 to 80% of your capabilities, but give your best to only 10%. That is a waste of time. After working extremely hard, the hero finally earned a 16-day paid vacation, and to make the most of it, went abroad and visited a famous restaurant. The bus had been calmly following the stone roads before it left its route because of a hole in the road. The driver steered carefully, and the man walking with a tablet in his hand staggered back and forth. Passers-by stopped to look at the overturned bus that broke through a section of the stone road. It seemed the man's short life had ended, or so he believed. After a while, the man who had recently been hit by a bus saw a beautiful sight as the sun's rays filtered through the clouds. The place felt disorienting. Nothing made sense, including where he was, what was happening, or why he had woken here, since he had clearly died moments earlier under a bus. Surrounded by clouds, a solar halo appeared before the man, and a female figure stood at its center. The voice asking if he was awake most likely came from her. The deceased soul realized who stood before him when the girl confirmed she was an observer watching over the galaxy. People usually called her the goddess. When the soul asked why she was there, she immediately confirmed his death and said the deceased were offered 3 choices for what would happen next. The first option is for the soul to go to heaven. The second option lets the soul return to Earth in a different body. The third option is for your soul to be reborn in another world. The goddess rushed, leaving the soul confused and prompting some reflection. A voice in her head made the girl smile and nod. She admitted she could be a little impatient. The deceased soul asked the goddess if the goddess could answer her questions, and the goddess agreed, since the soul stood before a deity. Curious, the soul chose the third option to discover what other world awaited it. The goddess smiled and began her tale. Artoria is a vibrant world rich in natural resources, home to 108 treasure-filled labyrinths you can explore in groups for exciting adventures. At age 5, residents undergo a baptism that grants special abilities and blessings, but life is not easy because dangerous monsters roam the world and class inequality persists. Listening to the goddess of the soul, I realized that in his previous life he had gone looking for a new hobby, and if he reincarnated in the same world, he was unlikely to find one, so the soul told the goddess he would go to another world. Spreading her arms, the goddess smiled again, accepted the deceased soul's choice, and said she could bestow on the soul any abilities or powers she desired. The soul refused the generous offer, saying a special power would cause needless conflicts and envy, and it did not want it, but it would not give up a healthy body, which surprised the goddess. After their conversation, the soul asked if the goddess always communicates with souls, and she replied that she does so very rarely. At 5, she saved a kitten that was her descendant, making this soul an exception, and the goddess wanted to thank the savior in person. After hearing the goddess of the soul's story, she noted that many are wrong to say pity does not help others, and the goddess, smiling slightly, hoped he would not keep that view. The goddess reached out to the formless light that represented the departed soul and wished her a happy, bright life. Later the clouds parted, the weather outside was clearly fine, and sunlight fell on a small village surrounded by farmland. A gentle wind moved the trees around a small stone house with its windows closed by wooden shutters. Inside, a man and a woman leaned over a child's bed. A pretty girl smiled and said good morning to the baby in front of her, adding how she felt, while the bearded man who said he was the child's father called his son cute. The boy stared with his mouth open at the new parents he met when he opened his eyes. A slightly awkward smile spread across his face. Pleased by her son's shy smile, Imria folded her arms across her chest and asked Lark to hold him. Lark agreed and said his son would grow up as strong as he was. As his parents rejoiced over his good behavior, he kept thinking he had woken up as a baby, and that made sense, but the lack of control over his body felt very uncomfortable. A small house stood alone by a well-trodden road in the forest, and the happy family's laughter could be heard. All was born into this world as a deceased soul. His baby body follows instinct. When hunger takes over, the baby cries without thought. When tired or full, the baby falls asleep. Being a baby is not easy. Impriya was the baby's mother, a beauty with an angelic face, and most mothers probably seem the most beautiful. The father was Lark, not very bright but still better than a tyrant. After a few days in a new body, Azul learned that his family are farmers and, thanks to a good harvest, will live peacefully in the near future, while in the Archeria farmers are generally seen as poor. The most important thing was that the child had only just found out. One evening, the villagers were drawn by my mother's voice as she noted it was getting dark. Holding her hands out in front of her, Imria said light, and a small snow-white ball appeared in her hands. One soul watched closely as the joyful mother and father smiled after a successful spell that lit the whole house. That was the most important thing. There is magic in this world. At the head of the village, magicians appeared as women or men wearing pointed hats and holding a ball of magic. If they couldn't use magic, rebirth had no point. Frowning in frustration and staring at the burning ball of light, a wool wondered how to activate magic and knew he had to try to conjure something immediately. He had to think about it. To use magic, a person needs some kind of resource, but for now he did not need to know what it was because feeling it in his body was enough. A sudden, apparently intense thought process overwhelmed the baby, and its body could not withstand the pressure, so the village immediately fell asleep. Sometime later, the village had already experienced many disastrous mistakes. When he concentrated, he immediately blacked out. Still, the body's basic needs are sleep and food. The village was not going to give up. Focusing, he began searching for the resource he needed to use magic, and finally found it. A small lump of energy formed in the center of his stomach, and though tiny, the village felt it. At that moment, the boy realized he could use the energy to do magic. To do that, he only needed to redirect it. One problem blocked the village's plan, and his body kept slipping into sleep. Seasons changed, winter turning into spring, and 6 months had passed since his birth in the new world. But during that time, the boy only ate, slept, and practiced magic, and he still had not grown up. Practice still paid off. Although a soul cannot use magic, he has learned to feel it throughout his body. It is very exhausting, but it is progress. Now is the best time to practice. Deciding to follow his mother's example for casting the light spell, he focused and silently recited it. The child's body could not hold the tension and reacted naturally, making the baby blush, and the village mother smiled and came to help her son change his diaper. Everything was expected to fail, and the boy did not expect it to be easy, so since he had plenty of time, he decided to keep going and not give up. Morning, afternoon, evening, night, a girl tried to cast a light spell, but nothing happened. The boy did not understand why he could not do anything, so he decided it was not worth copying his mother and imagined a brighter light like an LED lamp. The answer was close enough. The boy didn't have to copy his mother. He only needed to picture how an object from his past life would perform the necessary actions. I wonder whether he is the only one with that cheating ability. It didn't matter anymore. He could use magic now. The tool beamed and raised a small fist in victory. The little village now only needed practice, which would increase the magic supply, and as the baby imagined the cooler moving in their hands, a small storm broke out. Even if he began to understand how his magic works, he still has to do something first. The little village stretched, yawned, and slowly fell asleep. He was only a baby. The baby's mother entered the room and noticed it was suspiciously cool. 5 years later, the little village had grown noticeably, and his parents were eagerly preparing for his baptism. Such an event is hard to forget. Waving happily to his parents, a soul said goodbye and set off on his way, and today all children who reach the age of 5 will undergo the rite of baptism, which is a way to greet God and receive his mercy. Here, a blessing literally decides a person's fate. Among the many kinds of gifts, someone can get a weak power or one so strong they could build a country from scratch. The tool thought any blessing wasn't useless, but a welcome bonus to everyday life, so the boy wasn't very worried, and it reminded him of gacha games from his world. A short girl with a bright smile greeted the villagers. It was Murai, one of the main character's childhood friends who lived next door to him. Though a year older, the girl was like the village's little sister. They played together 3 times a week, and now when they meet they smile and hold hands. Near the local church, the children stood and talked about how today was finally the village baptism, which he had been waiting for a long time. It turned out Muri had not come just to meet the boy. She had come to tell him something important. The village was slightly surprised. His childhood friend told him to try not to tell anyone about his blessing, and though the village already knew, after laughing with the girl he said he did not know and that it was not worth talking about. Choosing to keep playing Deno, the boy asked why they could not talk about his blessing. Mir was likely not ready for that question because she probably did not know why herself. More embarrassed by the unexpected question, the girl screamed that she could not, and that was it. The reasons are simple. They decided not to talk about the children's powers to prevent shame and excessive pride. Outside it was bright and sunny, and inside a small church a baptism ceremony was taking place, with the priest beside the altar and a soul kneeling before him on one knee. Rising from his knees after greeting, the blond boy lifted his head to the priest, who hoped he was ready for the ceremony, and the villagers asked him to begin. The priest raised his hand over the boy's head and said that the mercy of the Creator God be with him, and his hand glowed with a bright shimmer. Bright light flooded a small body in the village, and he felt an unknown power fill every part of his body. Wrapped in a bright shimmer, the boy felt power spreading through him and wondered if it was a blessing. He closed his eyes and focused on the new sensations as the name of his ability formed in his mind. The word moderation popped into my mind. A silent question froze on the village's face. He felt confused and wanted to ask the priest, but he remembered no one should be told about the blessing. The blessing the hero received seemed to describe him from a past life. Those thoughts gave him a cold idea that perhaps God had hated him. Tears ran down the blonde's cheeks. The boy thought anyone would be grateful for such a blessing, but only the sweat of his heart flowed from his eyes. Only years later did the boy realize how useful his tears were. Returning home joyfully, he first told his parents that he had finally received his blessing. After greeting their son with warm smiles, his parents decided to cook a festive dinner to celebrate the joyful occasion. Squatting, Lark patted his son's cap and reminded him that every blessing is useful in its own way. His father laughed and said that whatever blessing his son received, he should be proud of it, but somehow the words sounded like consolation to the village. Some time later, a flock of birds flew over the treetops, beyond which the Rocky Mountains were hidden, and in the very center of the forest sat a short boy. Focusing his inner feelings into his hands, a ball of magical power formed, and when he said the words "wind bullet," it shattered the tree in front of his eyes. Pleased with the result, he realized he had finally added wind magic to his achievements, alongside fire, water, space, lightning, earth, and ice. Examining the wood fragments left after the magic, the boy said his magic had become much stronger, and he felt far less exhausted using it, yet his training from infancy was not wasted. Pleased with the results, he chose not to stop and kept training in the magic he needed for his ideal life. After thinking for a long time about what he could compare the attribute he needed to, he remembered his waste bag. All he had to do was introduce it. After concentrating and saying the phrase, "space for objects," a crevice opened in front of the village, revealing a completely empty space inside. Pleased by the unexpected but successful result, the boy decided to test the gap and pushed a stick into it. It disappeared the moment she touched the crevice. He finished the job perfectly. Now our hero had a storage space where time moved differently than it does for us. Anything stored there would always stay fresh. Coming home from productive training in the village, I found a table loaded with many different dishes, everything from buns and meat to vegetables. A large spread of food amazed the boy, and his mother told him they had well-browned fried meat for dinner, and he could eat as much as he wanted. The well bird is a weak monster found everywhere, yet you still need at least 3 people to handle one. Farmers value its meat because it tastes like chicken. The boy shared this meat recipe with his mother a year ago. He recently asked whether rolling the meat in breadcrumbs and frying it in oil would make it tastier, and his mother cooked it successfully on her first try. Sadly, this world had no condiments like soy sauce and only offered salt, so Adjul could not taste his favorite chicken and resolved to create all those seasonings here. At the hero's house there was always freshly baked bread and homegrown vegetables because his family grew them, so they were always made with love. If the buns are made with homemade yeast, Emery has promised that when her son brings the bride to the house, she will teach her the recipe for their family bread. As they began the meal, the father and son almost at once praised the cooking of their wife and mother, and she blushed slightly and offered to add a little extra seasoning. The village house had always been full of laughter and joy, and today was no different. After finishing his meal, the boy plopped down on the bed and wailed that even though he was growing, it was still important to know his size. If only he could use magic to activate cells, remove malignant substances, and cure diseases, true healing. Once he used the spell, the heaviness in his stomach lifted as if he'd been to hot springs. After that, you could go to bed. The village never had a chance to fall fully asleep. He heard his parents' anxious conversations about how this year could be very difficult because of crop diseases. Parents' worried voices continued outside the door as they made plans to survive the winter, and Anul's father decided to hunt monsters to earn money for the winter, a very dangerous idea. Imria anxiously lowered her head and asked her husband what would happen to them if one day he did not return from hunting. The next morning, the villagers went into the fields and grew bored with their own thoughts, and although children should not hear such conversations because they could do nothing, the boy would not stay inactive. Recalling yesterday's spell, the blonde decided to try it on wheat sprouts. After casting it, his whole body and the sprouts were bathed in a soft glow. Embarrassed by the name, the village decided not to dwell on it, and he wasn't sure he'd succeed, but if it worked out, he could earn money from it. Walking along the path toward her friend's house, a long-haired girl hummed cheerfully. Seeing Murray's familiar silhouette, she called her name and stopped mid-sentence. Seeing her friend, the girl hid behind the house, watching in awe and wondering if it was magic. How does the village use it? Frustrated behind Murray's house, she surprised herself by asking a strange question about why Aldu used magic in her family's fields. Feeling accomplished, the villagers fell onto the soft, wide fields with relief. He had managed to heal Paul and his girlfriend's family, but he was clearly tired and hungry. Remembering last night's dinner made us smile. Animal protein is necessary for a growing body, but farmers often cannot afford it. Those thoughts made the boy stand. After sitting down, our hero again said he wanted to eat meat. These thoughts will lead to strange consequences. A beast that looked like a boar, with strange mushrooms growing on its back, strolled slowly through the forest, unaware that a pair of tiny eyes watched it closely. Wild boars can grow up to 2 meters long. Their meat is tasty, but their real value is the mushrooms that grow on their heads and backs, which are considered a delicacy. In the newborn hunter's small head, only thoughts of tasty meat spun, and he immediately decided his mother would be pleased with such prey, even if he had to kill it himself. Strategy is the most important part of hunting. Avoid fire or lightning magic since they can burn the whole forest, and water or ice will spoil the meat's flavor. Choose your method carefully. The choice was clear. Using the windmill, a soul instantly killed its prey, which only managed a long grunt. Pleased with the result, the boy decided wind magic was best for hunting. Approaching his prey, he decided to cut the mushrooms first, then he washed the blood with magic. Sighing heavily, the tool was surprised. He stayed calm after the incident, and simply decided he had adapted to the structure of his new world. At first the boy could only guess his prey weighed about 500 kilos, and then he wondered how to tell his mother he had defeated a huge forest boar. Amused by his thoughts, the young hunter decided there was no point in hiding and would just say it straight. Sadly, the boy's optimism met a harsh reality when his mother gave him a withering look after the shocking news. Sitting on his lap, the child listened to a lecture about how his parents would worry if anything happened to him. His mother even remembered how often she warned him to stay away from monsters. Turning her anger into mercy, Imria praised her son for honestly admitting what he had done and told him not to hide anything from now on, and listen when his mother says a place is dangerous and not worth going to. When his mother's condition changed unexpectedly, Azul smiled guiltily, agreed with her, and asked her to forgive him. A smile spread across her face. Imria touched her son's small nose with her fingertip and told him he'd frightened her a lot and shouldn't do that again. After finishing her educational talks, she pointed out the booty her son had brought and offered to take care of it. The table was overflowing with food again, but the main dish was wild boar meat, its juices running onto the plate. While eating happily, one person noticed people hadn't lied about how good the mushrooms were. The mushroom soup was delicious, and the boar meat was very tasty even without salt. At dinner, Lark brought up an important question about when his son learned to do magic. Caught off guard by his father's question, the young man said the skills appeared when he received the blessing, and Lark accepted this without suspicion, concluding his son had a blessing. By dismissing the matter too quickly, he convinced himself he had finally found an excuse for his magic, but no one else knows the true nature of the blessing. The first question ended quickly, but the conversation kept going. My father asked whether he liked magic and what he needed it for. These questions somehow confused the whole village. He never wondered why he needed magic, but he firmly decided to use it to become richer and live a carefree, happy life. After laughing at his son's answer, Lark apologized for the odd questions, then grew serious and asked his son to remember. His face turned very serious, and he said that if the village relies only on force and uses it to hurt others, it is a bad deed. Suddenly changing his expression, the big man smiled and praised the cook and the village mother, who joined the conversation and asked everyone to eat before the food grew cold. The change only caused the boy to put another piece of the deliciously cooked food into his mouth. Night had fallen over the village, but the young hero's mind was crowded with the worry that he was getting too caught up in magic and might one day go astray. A soul felt grateful to be born into a family with loving parents. In his previous life, he had a strained relationship with his parents. It felt good to live in a loving family. Rolling onto his other side, the boy suspected the goddess had a hand in it, and an image of a smiling girl rose in his mind, demanding more gratitude. Soon the parents' warning proved true. A disease hit every field in the village, and many farmers lost their crops, and this fate affected more than just the family of Azul and his girlfriend Monsieur. The villager still enjoys magic, but remember he is a farmer, and now he must learn farm life so he can grow seasonings in his field. Closing his eyes happily, the boy replayed pleasant memories and imagined making soy sauce, miso paste, and most of all sugar. One day the villager, eager to grow sugar beet or sugar cane, told his parents he wanted his own field. She thought about her son's request, remembered the unfinished garden, then the boy eagerly asked to use it, and after she gave permission he thanked her with a smile. At the start of his venture, the boy burned with unhealthy enthusiasm, but the sight of the abandoned garden clearly dampened it. After looking over the work, the boy felt resentful and decided this clearly wasn't the right place for a 5-year-old to grow, and he figured his mother probably didn't think he'd take it seriously. He steadied himself, told himself it was too early to lose heart, and thought these moments were made for magic, so a wind cutter sprang into action with its thin blade slicing the tall grass. Stronger spells came into effect next. Levitation made it possible to nearly uproot trees. The earth's tremor removed unnecessary irregularities. After a while, the villager leaned back, breathing heavily and looking around contentedly at what he had managed to do during that time. After that, the boy collapsed to the ground, crying that he was exhausted. Still, using so much magic clearly drains a lot of magical energy. Achieving that result with magic proves how far our hero has come, and if he keeps developing, he will become even stronger. Finished with his rest, the young farmer picked up a hoe as large as he was and immediately moved on to the next stage. As the village began putting the next part of the plan into action, it happily thought that working the soil was one of the best parts of a farmer's job. First clear the land of weeds, then sow seeds in the ground, and at that moment the village's joyful stream of thoughts was interrupted. The word seeds stopped the young boy in his tracks, and he forgot that you need seeds to sow the earth. Back home, the future farmer immediately went to his father to ask if sugar beet seeds could be obtained in this world. Lark answered his son's question clearly. The seeds were well known, but no farmer in their kingdom could grow them. The boy was surprised. When he heard his father's answer, he felt upset because his plan was already starting to fail, even though he hadn't even tried. Noticing his only son's disappointment, Lark told Tom that traders from another country would soon arrive, and Tom might be able to find those seeds. Those words restored hope to the young heart. Merchants, even without seeds now, can be asked to extract them and bring them next time for the village. His father quickly told him that those merchants' goods are often expensive and they might not be able to afford them, but the boy was not deterred because he went there not just for seeds but to hear adventure stories. Lark patted his flighty son on the head and said he would definitely go with him to the merchants. Night fell on the village. The next day, the lively villagers decided that even without money, he could still find something to trade for seeds. Merchants value nuts, medicinal herbs, and mushrooms from wild boars, but his goal today was different. The village, however, loves meat. The tree deer is a deer-like monster that holds the highest rank among the inhabitants of its forest, and its horns are used to make medicines and are highly valued. Standing in the center of the forest and casting detection magic from beneath the village, thin lines of magical energy began to spread through the woods. The spell drew lines and overlapping circles that intersected in many places and was designed to find prey. It lets you sense the presence of all living beings and works like an echo sounder. Even after detecting the faintest fluctuations with my spell, I still couldn't find a tree deer nearby. It seemed there was nothing worth seeing, but then the magician sensed a wild boar. Deciding not to waste time searching longer, the boy headed toward the forest boar, intending to deal with it first and then continue looking for the deer. Familiar bird and insect calls filled the forest, a breeze ruffled the treetops, and deep in the forest wilderness, the young hunter watched his unsuspecting prey. After a short search, the village found a boar, but the boy stood behind a tree looking confused and half asleep while the boar barely moved. They needed to get closer to the boar to see what was happening. After a couple of steps, the villagers' eyes widened in shock. A huge brown bear, clearly a rare visitor to their forest, went to eat the boar the village had chosen and stayed hidden. The hidden bear is a monster that looks like a bear but usually does not live in the forest. It lives in the mountains, has a long body, is quite aggressive, can destroy an entire village, and is hard to detect. With the bear busy eating, there was a chance to defeat him. It was enough to stay hidden and strike suddenly. A burst out of hiding and shouted as the windbreaker, and 2 wind blades flew from his hands, cutting through every obstacle on the way to their target. Unexpectedly, the bear noticed one boy, shocking the other. With his paws crossed in front of him, the bear braced for a blow. The impact made only small streams of wind around the bear. He blocked it. Aeusel thought about how thick his skin was and whether he could feel magic. The bear, its dinner interrupted, growled. At high speed, the monster charges through the trees toward the boy. If the distance between the bear and the young hunter stays large enough, there is still a chance to find a solution. If the bear reached the village, he would lose his life. This arrangement clearly did not suit him. Putting his hands on the ground, the magician raised a stone wall in front of him. The wall failed to stop the bear. Cracks appeared after the first blow. The village was in shock. The wall was about 50 centimeters thick, made of clay and concrete, and the bear broke through it easily. Calming down was crucial now. The village could do it, and an angry opponent can be defeated with simple tricks. Roaring, the bear broke through the wall built in front of it, and at that same moment the village activated a new spell, Pit, that removed the ground beneath its paws. The monster crashed down with its heavy carcass, still giving long, drawn-out growls as the village prepared to create a new spell. A waterfall and a powerful rush of water poured into the pit where the bear had recently fallen. It would be nearly impossible for a person to escape that. The monster began floundering in the water but remained alive, and at the end of his battle, a soul triggered a rockfall. No sound came from under the collapsed stones. Now the bear definitely could not escape. He might have drowned in the pit, but it was better to act to be sure. With that thought, a soul put his cat back on. Breathing heavily, the boy realized the danger he had just faced. His strength was at its limit, so he decided it was too soon for him to fight such opponents. Although the bear was a dangerous opponent, it remains a valuable commodity, so the village pulled its trophy from under the rubble and cleaned the blood from the body. Despite everything, the boy returned home alive, but he could not escape his own mother's fate because a bear carcass lay behind him. The bear was very dangerous. Even worried about her son, Emria could still assess his abilities objectively. The parents agreed they were lucky to escape the fight with the monster in one piece, and that only adventurers of rank C or higher could defeat it. From that conversation, the boy concluded his magic was roughly equal to an adventurer's C rank, though he didn't know if that was high or low. Turning back to the defeated monster, the parents saw the skin was in excellent condition and could be sold for a good price. Wealthy buyers will pay well for the hide to make a stuffed animal or a high-stealth cloak, and every part can be used for something other than meat, but it smells too strong. Cheerfully jumping up, Ossel asked whether he had enough money for sugar beet seeds after selling the skin, and his father said there would still be money left. The boy smiled at his father and told him he would give the remaining money to his parents. The father smiled and thanked him. A stern female voice cut through the cheerful noise, telling the boy that his mother was still angry and their conversation was not over. Night was falling over the village. The hunt had been successful, and the boy had enough money to buy seeds and maybe buy something else from the merchants. The wait for tomorrow felt exciting. The next morning was very stormy. The village bells kept ringing, and farmers were already plowing. The bells made noise, and so did the merchants who arrived in the square to set up their goods. Anul and his father watched the guests, then went over and greeted one of them. A man with long hair and clothes clearly out of place greeted an old friend, and their conversation quickly turned businesslike. They discussed the usual seed purchase and asked for an evaluation of the product. Glancing to the side, the man was surprised that by prey, the farmer meant the carcass of a bear on a cart. Lark smiled at his old friend and told a made-up story about a bear that fell into a trap and died, saying he had found it by accident. The merchant stared at the monster thoughtfully. That is an obvious lie. The hidden bear is too smart and cunning to fall for a trap set by ordinary hillbillies, so there must be a reason for such a blatant lie. The merchant turned and looked at the little boy. Meeting the merchant's gaze, the boy smiled brightly, unaware of the merchant's thoughts. The trader found the boy odd and immediately suggested he had been the one to catch such a unique prey. No child could catch a monster like that. The trader did not want to argue, and Lark could not have taken anyone's loot, so refusing the deal made no sense. After examining it, the merchant said the carcass was of excellent quality, had no major damage, so almost anything could be used, and he offered 100 gold to buy it. The sum surprised the young village. No won their own gold coins, and converted to yen each coin would be worth 10,000 yen. The thought of getting 1,000,000 yen for a single bear excited the boy. If he keeps hunting, he'll get rich fast. The villagers already imagined piles of gold coins raining down on him. His admiring thoughts about the village were cut short when his father told Lebrant to stop fooling around and reminded him that he had been buying from him for a long time. The merchant awkwardly insisted that Lark could not be fooled, and Lark replied that he was poor but not a fool and knew how much such a carcass was worth, grinning angrily. After giving in to the farmer's pressure, Lebrant set 2 bags of gold on the table and said 170 gold was the most he could offer for a bear. Surprised that he had almost been deceived, Azul decided to learn the market prices of goods in this world, because otherwise he would keep making easy money without really knowing their prices. Glaring at the merchant, the boy told himself he would not be so easily fooled next time as his father finished the transaction. As soon as Lark mentioned the sugar beet seeds, someone's eyes lit up. The merchant was surprised. They were looking for unusual sugar beet seeds and said it was a very unusual request. Still, he began searching for a single bag because the farmer was going to grow a rare vegetable that few people could grow, and Lark said it was his son's idea. Lebrant pulled out the coveted bag and said he wanted 20 gold pieces for one. It was expensive, but the village that had gotten what it wanted had already vanished from this world, and Lark and the merchant kept inspecting the goods. After a moment, the man turned to his son and asked if he wanted anything else, and his son immediately said he needed a knife. A knife is essential for a hunter, needed for cutting an animal, skinning, cooking, and if the village runs out of magic, for the village's self-defense. Lark paled and said his wife would be very upset if he bought it, picturing every possible consequence, but his son's shining eyes were weapons of mass destruction. Lebrant kept a firm grip on the merchant and quickly offered his customers several suitable knives. After failing to pick a village, he said he wanted everything. His father was surprised, but his sparkling gaze made refusal impossible. One condition of the purchase was not to tell his wife, but she is terrible when angry, and both men in the family have experienced that. After buying the knives, the boy's father said he still needed to speak with the merchant, who suggested the young farmer look around more. As he walked among the gathered people inspecting the goods, his gaze fixed on one thing. The sight clearly surprised him. Seeing the goods, the villagers' cheeks flushed with happiness and excitement, and that ended the trip to the square to the merchants. Both the pouch and the clay pot were filled to the brim with soybeans and yeast, and the merchant gave the yeast away for free, so I should thank him because now I can make soy sauce and miso. Closing his eyes, Walt told himself the highlight of today's program was sugar bee, and unable to hold back his emotions, said it aloud. Sugar is very expensive in this world, and how it's made is kept secret. Farmers can only dream of it. The boy chuckled, remembering that even Lebrant didn't have any for sale. Our hero would not tolerate that and wanted sweets, donuts, cookies, muffins, everything. Sugar beet is a common root vegetable that is easy to grow if you follow a few simple tips. First, take care of the beds. Beetroot will spoil if any part stays wet, so provide a way for excess water to drain. Both surface water and groundwater can cause problems. Beets are sensitive to acidic soil, so use rice husks or shells as fertilizer, and the beetroot will begin to grow quickly. Proudly gathering a ball of magic in his hands, the duelist thought that since it exists in this world, it must be used. He used magic to speed growth, pointed his hand toward the plowed beds, and a stool cast a spell that sent a cloud of magic spreading through the entire garden. At first, small sprouts pushed up from the ground, then they grew to medium size. The spell worked. Beetroot has taken root in this land. To further improve the beetroot's taste with magic, the stool activated its magical powers again. Next, watering had to be handled, so a small experiment could be carried out. The young farmer decided to water one part of the beetroot with water made by magic and the other with ordinary well water, then watch which helps it grow. The experiment had limited success. Relying heavily on magic hinders growth, but combining magic with conventional methods yields better results. One day the village will be able to produce high-quality sugar. Thinking of sweet desserts, his face broke into a blissful smile and salvation flowed from his mouth. That evening, the whole family of farmers rejoiced over the money they had earned for the bear because it would help them survive this winter. When they received the joyful news that the money had arrived, Lark asked his son if he liked the trip to the merchants, and the son immediately agreed and told his mother what he had bought. After the story, the village mother kept asking if her son had bought anything besides the seed, her eyes shining with suspicion. Under pressure, the boy went pale and muttered weak excuses, but his father pushed him forward with grim resolve and told his wife he had bought 4 knives. His father lacked not only the ability to stay silent, but it seemed, the ability to think. In the suspended air, a furious, insistent voice pronounced the names of a soul and a lark. A sparkling, seemingly angelic smile hid the anger in her voice when she asked what it all meant. He had no choice but to kneel and beg for mercy. All decided to show the beans he bought from the merchants to his childhood friend, who watched the strange beans in the boy's hands with interest. Myri looked with interest at her friend of virginity and asked what he was holding, and he willingly told the little girl that they were soybeans, delicious in any form and good for long-term storage. Soak the soy in plenty of water, then cook it over low heat until soft, drain it in a colander and mash it evenly, then mix the mash with yeast and salt. Once the whole process is finished, the mass just needs to be postponed until the evening. Murais was pleased by her friend's knowledge and simply admired what he was doing. The village has magically raised the room temperature to 60 degrees to prevent a 2-week delay in the process. Clearly interested in what the boy was doing, Murray began asking him questions, and he was very surprised. The long-haired girl waved her arms and painted with words how the villagers' hands brought the shine, and what is now, and what used to be on her family's field. The boy felt confused by the pressure, surprised someone had seen him then, and told himself he hadn't been careful. Dealing with children was still easy. When a soul mentioned a field of flowers in the forest, Mir immediately switched to something more exciting than the glitter in the boy's hands. In the end, the young magician led his girlfriend through the forest to that very flower field. Feeling guilty, he knew explaining it would be too difficult and simply apologized to himself. That evening, two children next door opened a clay pot and found a thick brown paste inside called miso. While stirring his latest culinary creation, Akel said the recipe needed more refinement, but it was not bad for a first attempt, and Mir wondered whether it was edible since she had never seen anything like it. The cook took a spoonful of the mixture from the pot, fried it over low heat, added vegetables, and offered the finished dish to his girlfriend to taste. Reluctantly, she grimaced, unsure about trying something new, yet she still took a bite. At the same moment, her face lit up. Childlike eyes shone with delight. The taste was incomparable and simply divine. Her reaction made the boy laugh. Azul set aside half the harvest for his girlfriend and told her it could be diluted with water to make soup, used to marinate meat, or simply fried with fish. After bidding Myril farewell, the boy felt lost and sat thinking. The young farmer's first seasoning was miso. If he keeps experimenting with new ingredients, he will be able to make even tastier seasonings. With soy now and sugar arriving soon, he can try making soy sauce and would like to cook meat with teriyaki, but that is still far off. To make teriyaki sauce, you need sugar and mirin, and while the sugar issue has largely been resolved, making mirin is still unclear. You can substitute mirin with alcohol or honey, because mirin is a sweet rice wine used only for cooking, and honey is the easiest option to find. Honey can be found in the forest, but the search for ingredients should wait for now. Night fell on the village, but the villagers had set goals and would not stop there. The morning seemed no different from usual, and he went downstairs, rubbed his eyes sleepily, and wished everyone a good morning. His mother greeted him in an amazingly joyful voice, her face beaming with happiness, but there was clearly an unhealthy gleam in her eyes, and his father looked a little strange. Noticing his mother had clearly slept well today, the boy said her beloved son's early sleep had helped her so much. Emra has lately been insisting that her son go to bed early. Maybe he really looks too tired. His mother looks even more beautiful than he does. It may be the new makeup. The tired father, who gave a brief smile across the table, answered very eloquently. They had to drop the cosmetics option because the house didn't even have a bathtub. Bath, the word felt like a crushing weight on the boy's shoulders. After finishing the morning routines and the gathering, a stool enthusiastically decided to build a bath that day. It is unclear why the idea of building a bath did not occur to Azul earlier. Perhaps that was because no one in the village had one. Still, a clear plan was needed to build it. They decided to use a tree as the base. The bathtub should be more spacious and comfortable than usual, but the thought of a warm bath gave him a strange, contented look. With a clear plan, a magic tool strengthened his body and then used the wind to chop down trees. Dig a hole using earth magic, build the main frame, then build the walls and ceiling. At last the bath was ready after all the work. It was a success. The tub was roomy but not too big. Our young master also dug a channel so the bath water would flow out gently and applied water repellent magic so the tree would not rot. The village also built a hall with a locker room, but it only had basic items like a closet, a rug, and a couple of towels in a laundry basket. He admired his creation, thinking that since he had used magic, the process had taken almost no time and might cause problems later, but for now that did not matter. The young master paused, admiring the new building, when a voice asked what kind of shack it was. The voices are Emria and Lark. Apparently the older family members came to ask what their son was working so hard on. First the father asked if the village had built this place itself, and when he got confirmation, he praised his son's talent. The mother then joined in and asked to see inside. The bathtub was new, so everything gleamed inside. Lark immediately recognized it as a bathtub. The boy only confirmed his father's guesses by saying the Holy Father had told him about it. After sending his parents out the door of the shack and saying he finally wanted a bath, he immersed his small body in warm water. In the warm water, from which thick steam rose, the boy felt reborn and had no regrets about spending the time, but an admiring voice interrupted his solitude. Lark and Emria stepped into the tub, admired its luxury, and lamented that they had never imagined working on a farm would allow them to visit a place like this. His parents' appearance surprised the boy, so he asked why they had undressed and assumed they had come to join him in the bathroom. Their weak display of indignation did not stop the two adults. Claiming to be one family, they plunged into the bathroom with their outraged son, and afterward almost all the hot water was gone. Relaxing in the warm water, Lark said the bath was just what he needed, and he felt all his fatigue draining away. Imri supported him and said it would be good to take her every day. She turned to her son and asked in a voice that sounded slightly threatening, while the smile on her face made it clear this would not end well, and he tensed. Panic filled the boy's eyes. His mother's smile was chilling, and what she had just said made it clear no one had forgotten the hunt for the hidden bear. To avoid any damage, I had to tell them his parents could have occasional bath days. He had already smiled sweetly at his son, and Maria said that he and his father love him very much, which made the boy blush. By nightfall, he returned home completely exhausted, a little overheated from the bath, and his face still looked like a ripe tomato. The boy was very tired and already lying on his bed, while his parents seemed to have found another burst of energy and were exchanging all kinds of affectionate phrases. She wished her son good night and asked him to fall asleep quickly. Imakria was told he was already sleepy after the bath. The next morning felt a little unusual again. Imria's face glowed with happiness, and her skin looked even smoother. The troll began to suspect he was missing out on something good, and seeing a tired father only deepened his doubts. In the forest near the village, a white-haired boy watched the scurrying insects with clear interest. It was undeniable, they were definitely bees. A strange mix of emotions crossed the boy's face when he realized this, mostly happiness with a clear edge of displeasure. At last he found them. That explained his slight dissatisfaction. The search for bees had taken a long time, but he finally located a hive, and where there is a hive there is honey. On closer inspection, the bees were slightly larger than in his world, but that made no difference, as thoughts of honey clouded a wolf's mind, and he could no longer control his face or his thoughts. After forming a square barrier that cut the bees off from the outside, the boy immediately used a fireball, perhaps to eliminate the threat to his life. After trapping the bees inside the burning barrier, all that remained was to wait, and soon the magician's efforts paid off. The bees collapsed to the ground, completely motionless. The smoke deprived them of oxygen and they died immediately. As Ossel moved closer to inspect the bees, he realized the insects were enormous. They might not be bees but monsters that just looked like them. If so, the boy needs to be careful. Odd noises came from behind him, so he turned and found a huge hornet hovering right in front of his face. Only one bee survived. She was larger than the others and likely their queen. The boy watched the insect in front of him, afraid, then let his guard down. Hovering a little longer, the bee's strength began to fade, and it glided to the ground, tightening the boy's heart. All that planning just to get honey, and now he felt like a monster. The village was caught off guard. A faint request for help rang in his head, and he involuntarily widened his eyes. Guiltily watching the weakened queen bee, he asked whether she was trying to tell him something. His conscience had already spoken. Even so, you must fight the strong, not the weak. Guided by his conscience, a soul used healing magic. At first the bee fluttered its wings uncertainly, then rose and circled the boy as if to thank him. Smiling at the flying insect, the young magician felt relieved that she was better, since he had caused what happened to her. To the boy's surprise, a bee landed gently on his shoulder, clearly determined to continue the journey only that way. Watching the insect, a soul gently asked what her actions meant and whether that meant she wanted to go with him, and the insect actively nodded its muzzle. A wolf raised a finger to his face and thought about it. If his mom sees a bee, she'll probably get mad again, but if he offers something. After examining the bee, the boy said she could go with him if she produced honey now and then. She nodded more eagerly at the request, and the boy thanked his new companion, saying she was now his familiar and he was glad to meet her. Somehow a quick trust formed between them. Amel looked at his new companion and wondered what to name her. The queen bee is the queen bee. Abruptly choosing a new name, he told the bee she would from now on be called Queen, and the village responded with joyful wing waving. After lingering a bit where he had met a new friend, the boy continued his hunt. The villagers had never seen such a healthy boar. Before them stood one with strange crystals growing on it, and its entire body covered in scars and cuts. It was clearly a monster, but monsters do not live in that forest. Maybe he came down from the mountains looking for food. That wasn't important. We need to come up with a strategy. A wool was pulled from his thoughts by his new companion, who began to flap her wings. The boy took this as a question and said he was thinking about how to catch that boar. Quinn dropped into a fighting stance. When asked to help, she rushed to the front at incredible speed, ignoring the village. Quinn moved so fast that he fooled the boar and with one swift, precise motion, forced him to make a pained, inarticulate sound. Each move made the queen faster, and the blows to the boar grew more accurate and seemed more painful. After a long series of powerful blows, the boar finally fell to the ground, and the bee hovered above it, wings raised in a victorious pose, unable to speak but clearly showing with her stance that she could. Running joyfully to meet her companion, a soul rushed over to praise and thank her for what she had done, which was truly amazing. A happy smile spread across the boy's face as he kept praising Quinn, who was glad to get so much praise, but now Quinn had to drag this boar home. Arriving home at last, he placed his new prey on the empty spot in front of the doors, and the village heard from his father that he was surprising them again with his exploits. Ferocious monsters once lived in the forest thickets and bothered the villagers, so they hired adventurers, and the boy's father said the man probably came from the mountain, and that he was very glad his son returned unharmed. Amria had already started scolding her son for his reckless behavior, but her face went pale as she realized something else was bothering her. For example, a huge bee flew behind the embarrassed villagers and looked like a daughter-in-law who clearly was not expected in that house. The boy told the pale mother that this was his familiar and that she did no harm to people, adding that the queen herself had defeated the monster. They decided to come in with Trump, so the mother would not have a chance to refuse to leave the bee. A soul said that by his familiar promise she would make honey for us. Emery's face lit up at those words. The whole family clearly loved sweets, so when someone promised to make honey, my mother immediately welcomed a new companion into the house, which was a little confusing. The reception felt odd, but Azul was clearly glad his new friend was not exposed, and Quinn was pleased too. The job was small. We had to build a house for the new tenant. After gathering all the supplies for the village, Murai and I headed to the forest, which had already become a familiar place to work. After measuring and setting the honeycombs on the table with a light tap, while two pairs of curious eyes watched, a stool remained focused on his work. I heard a curious, girlish voice asking about what he was building this time. The boy said it was a hive where bees live and make a thick liquid kept in a pot. Mary dipped her finger into the substance, tasted it, and smiled as sweetness spread across her mouth. The queen bee could subdue other bee species, so many hives formed. Bees make honey and protect residents from monsters, and mixing different kinds of honey only made it tastier. After setting the hives on the ground, someone was clearly pleased with his work and already looked forward to what he could make from the queen hive's honey. The boy decided to cook raw ham using honey from the queen, and his friends cheered as he began. Many kinds of cured ham exist, but this time they chose pancetta. Although Asul had explained it, both of his companions still had no idea what it was. Pancetta means pork belly in Italian and is also called raw salted bacon. Begin by cooking the meat, then cut the brisket into strips and let it marinate for a week before leaving it to wilt for 2 or 3 months. The key to great brisket is the marinade, or samri, made from water, salt, honey, onion, and garlic. Mix all the ingredients in a saucepan, bring to a boil, and let it cool. The honey from Queen gives the marinade its special flavor. Myril learned she would have to wait until the new dish was ready and felt a little annoyed they would not try it today. Smiling guiltily, Awul apologized and promised to cook plenty for the winter. After marinating the brisket in the pan, they set it on a barrier and placed a cooler on top to let it dry completely. Then O'Neill and Murai said goodbye. Sitting down on the ground, the boy smiled at the thought that he would always have honey within reach, and on New Year's Eve he could eat brisket, all thanks to Queen. Life in the village remains slow and carefree, and soon it will be time to harvest the sugar beets. When the beetroot is harvested, the boy will have honey and sugar, so sweets no longer feel out of reach, and the day he can eat them is getting closer. The sugar beet harvest has finally arrived. Awul stood in his kitchen, full of hope, preparing sugar together with Quinn. First, peel the beetroot to remove the thick skin and cut it into cubes about 1 centimeter across. Then place everything into hot water at 70 degrees. Next, wrap the pan in a thick cloth and let it sit for about an hour. Then remove all the pieces and put the pan back on the heat to continue cooking the juice. Simmer the juice for about an hour, skimming off any foam, and when it reaches a syrup-like consistency, lower the heat and continue cooking. When the mixture turns white, put out the fire and keep stirring the adhesive until it hardens. Put the results of all actions on a dry plate, and everything will be ready. The result fell short of the village's hopes, but nothing is perfect the first time. The boy tasted a sample and was sure it was sugar, yet it was still impure and only mildly sweet. Curious whether magic could purify sugar, the young chef began to imagine what it would look like and how to picture it. After thinking about it, I pictured a washing machine. Use the magic of water. Imagine it spinning. During extraction, the water vortex swept up the sugar pieces that had been lying on the plate. The vortex kept spinning, and it was already clear that the excess impurities were disappearing, pulling moisture from the sugar and leaving 2 piles. The sugar turned out perfect. Its snow-white color looked like a snowy mountain, and the taste was just right. Because the sugar beet harvest was good, the village had a lot of work extracting sugar, so time passed quickly without anyone noticing. In his secluded corner, where his odd workshop stood, a pile of clay pots sat on an empty square beside a small house. Each jar held sugar, and as the villagers prepared them, the taste became richer and brighter. Those reserves will be enough for him until next year. After winter, he will need to plant more beets because some seeds remain. That supply will yield 2 or 3 more harvests. With sugar and honey, the village now had everything it needed to make sweets, and a happy smile lit up his face because he was one step closer to his dream. Deciding to try cooking now, the young chef got to work. He chose to start with something simple. I kneaded the dough and lit the oven. After a while, a null ran to his parents eager to share his cooking, not saying what he had made, and only that he wanted to please them. Moved, the parents were very happy to hear those words from their son and embraced him with love. He really was a wonderful boy. The happy parents, surprised to find round dough pieces in their hands, were eager to try what their son had cooked. When they lifted the pieces to their mouths, they bit down together and heard a crunch. Both parents, amazed by what they had just tried, turned to their son with sparkling eyes, but his mother, calling him a boy, looked a little confused. The woman's face looked happy, but something about it was a little frightening, and when asked what it was, she would immediately say it was a cookie. Smiling, Imria asked her son if this was all he had prepared, and he said he wanted to sell some of it to Mr. Lebrand. The woman's frightened scream made it clear this could not be done under any circumstances, otherwise a fierce battle would follow. The mother kept putting small rounds of dough into her mouth and assured her son she would take care of the rest of the cookies. Asu felt a little upset. Curious, Imria asked her son how he had found the recipe, but the boy, smiling awkwardly, lied that it was part of his blessing and that he should show due respect to the goddess. The basket of cookies emptied quickly, and the chance to sell them vanished just as fast. All 50 cookies all cooked were eaten by his mother. Apparently he did not fully realize how much women love sweets. Although his mother seems happy now, the memories still make me a little worried. When the merchants returned to the village, the boy decided to show Lebrant what he could make from sugar beet and what he had bought from him last time, sure it would interest him. Lebrant held a handful of sugar in his palm and said he had never seen sugar so snow-white, and he immediately understood everything about honey. Essel did not know that the creatures he killed in the forest then were killer bees, but his understanding was essentially correct. Lebrant quickly put his trading skills to use and asked how much his new colleague was willing to sell, and the colleague replied without hesitation that there were about 20 cans of sugar and 10 barrels of honey. The merchant gave a slight businesslike smile and, in a light-hearted tone, said he would buy everything the boy had just offered. No one had expected such an outcome. Lebrant set his prices for the goods, 5 gold pieces for sugar and 4 for honey. He even offered 5 extra silver coins for the quality of the sugar. Andal, surprised by the price, sank back into dreams of unprecedented wealth, mentally converting the gold coins into the currency of his previous life. The boy suddenly composed himself, fixed his gaze on the merchant, and asked whether the merchant was joking with him. The abrupt change surprised the man. He smiled awkwardly and shrugged. Lebrant noted that Lark's son could not be fooled and raised the fee for honey and sugar. Pleased with the results, the villagers found an effective way to influence the merchant. In fact, Lebrand had been a good man since he arrived in their village, and he should be grateful for the product. Grateful for the successful deal, the boy handed the man a small basket and said it was a little bonus for their cooperation. Spotting something unclear, the merchant decided to find out what it was. The villagers saw no point in hiding and said they were cookies he had made with sugar. When the merchant bit one, it crunched. The unexpectedly pleasant sweetness caused a wave of surprise. The merchant's first question was whether the boy had baked it himself, and the boy quickly confirmed that he had. The reaction to the honest answer was too weak, leaving the village slightly confused. He had clearly not been prepared for such a drastic change in behavior. Lebrant proved a good merchant. To his new partner, he said he would pay 1 gold piece for each basket of those cookies if any remained. The price left the boy stunned. He knew honey and sugar were costly, but charging that much for a single cookie seemed excessive. He smiled awkwardly. The ghoul said he had only 1 basket left, received a quick offer to buy it, and was asked to wait briefly while someone counted the money. Not wanting to trouble the merchant with calculations, the boy quickly announced the final price. Having calculated his profit so many times, it would be strange if he did not know how much he would receive. Brant's strained smile was so obvious, the young merchant immediately had questions. Handing the boy a heavy bag of gold, the man decided to be direct and asked if the boy wanted to work for him when he grew up. Taken aback by the offer, the boy said he could not even dream of it because he was only a poor farmer, offering a brief, graceful refusal. The man in the hat watched the village recede and thought that no matter how hard he tried, a poor farmer could not earn 230 gold in a single transaction. The man also believed the child would face many difficulties in the future. One day, a minor accident occurred. Mir fell ill and lay in bed with a fever for a while, with a tool sitting on a chair beside her. She was clearly running a high fever, but she kept apologizing that her friend had to sit with him. It wasn't hard for the boy. After all, his girlfriend's parents had gone into the field, so he couldn't leave her alone in that state. A soul looked with compassion at his girlfriend, who had once been joyful and now seemed anemone-like, advised her to rest more and drink more water, and she agreed quietly, and time slowly passed as the sun continued its path across the sky. Ray was too weak from the fever and fell asleep, and the village had been waiting for this. He got up from the chair, looked around, and realized no one was nearby. The boy placed his hand on his friend's face and activated healing magic. A gentle stream of light slightly enveloped the girl's body. Her breathing returned to normal, and her sleep grew calmer. Once she's healed, her fever will be gone by morning, and Murray will be the smiling girl he knows. Covering his friend with a blanket, he wished her well. Children across the village are falling ill with the same symptoms, fever and weakness. It's most likely due to poor hygiene, since adults with at least some reserve of magic can purify themselves. To solve this problem without using magic, you need soap. In this world, soap exists, but it is expensive, ineffective, and smells bad because it is made from fat. After waiting until the next day, the village made a grand plan to make soap. Quinn always followed him wherever he went. Trying to make the soap more pleasant to use, the boy decided to add flowers, but did not know which flowers existed and wished someone could tell him. Then his gaze fell on the queens and he thought, found. He really has someone who can tell him about the flowers. A queen knows them better than anyone. With his familiar's help, I will create a beautiful tree with snow-white flowers. Admiring their beauty, he immediately recognized them as camellia flowers. Without delay, the boy began gathering the seeds that had fallen to the ground. You can plant a couple of chameleon trees at home. Bees will be attracted, and the home landscape will come to life. After collecting a whole bag of semen, a stool wiped the sweat from his forehead and smiled happily at the results of his fruitful work. About 2 to 3 kilograms of seeds are needed to make 1 liter of chameleo oil, and if he wants to grow chamelea trees, he should properly stock up on seeds. Making chameleon oil is simple. Spread the seeds in the sun to dry and leave them there all day. We steam the seeds for 15 minutes to remove moisture and make the next steps easier. Then we peel the seeds from the husk using magic. You need a press to extract the oil. Hitting the wedge with a hammer makes the mortar squeeze the seeds and release their oil. Filter the oil to remove seed particles. The result is a pure, nearly transparent oil with a pleasant texture and a simply delicious scent. Then add potassium hydroxide to the oil. It can be obtained by mixing calcium hydroxide and potassium carbonate. Begin by collecting garden weeds and burning them. Mix the ashes with water. Sediment will settle at the bottom, while other residues float on the surface. Potassium carbonate forms the bottom sediment. To make calcium hydroxide, mix quicklime with water, and the village bought the quicklime from Lebrant. Mixing the ingredients produces potassium hydroxide, and adding chameleo oil turns it into a soap base. The soap base already smelled amazing. Now, I just need to pour it into a mold cut from wood. After making several soaps in different shapes, the maker first tested one on himself in the bathtub. The room smelled wonderful, and the soap lathered well. At this rate, he will be able to sell it too. Maria joined her son in the bath and grew curious about a soap they had not bought. The boy, still in the warm water, said he had made it himself by adding a little oil and that they could try using it. The whole family tried a new soap made with chameleon oil. The next day its effects were obvious, and Emery's face lit up with admiration. Its amazing scent and skin benefits clearly gave it an edge. The village family seems to have grown used to this kind of morning, with Emria looking happy and almost renewed, Lark tired, and Azul no longer understanding anything. At last it was time to meet Murray, and because she had been ill recently, the first thing discussed was her health. Smiling and greeting her friend, Asis, the long-haired girl said she was already much better and clearly could not do without the village's help, more precisely without his care for her. Happy that his girlfriend was feeling much better, the boy said he had brought her something. It was a small treat of venison and a basket of cookies. Thanks were also offered. The gifts for Mina Ray did not end there when the boy gave his girlfriend a flower-shaped soap, and she admired its beauty and scent, while a friend advised them to wash their hands every day. Telling her he made the soap just for her clearly moved the little girl, and saying he didn't want her to get sick only deepened the blush on the children's cheeks. Grateful for her friend's care and concern, Mepper gave her childhood friend a light kiss on the cheek. Now they are both blushing. The The simple farmer's peaceful days continued as the seasons slowly shifted and winter returned to the street. He tossed a couple more logs into the fireplace as the zoo complained about the cold, but there was nothing he could do about it. Still, winter had really crept up on them unnoticed. Despite winter's arrival, the trading season remained one of the village's noisiest, and Ossel went alone to the square to calmly greet Lebrant in person. The merchant greeted her supplier, and they started talking about business. The supplier apologized for asking to make only these goods, explaining that the capital's nobility was addicted to them. Lebrant warned his friend that many people were asking where he gets the goods, and so far he has managed to hide the supplier, but he cannot promise the same if the ruling family comes to him. The man apologized again that his warnings were all he could offer, smiled awkwardly, and received the same smile in return. Everyone had always believed that merchants cared only about themselves, but Lebrant looked exhausted as he handed him a bag of money. The situation was clearly much harder than Lebrant had told him. A soul decided not to bother the merchant with more trouble and said he would stop bringing him goods, since nothing unusual could be sold in winter, and he would return with something better in spring. Lebrant laughed, saying he was doing it so his friend could get a little rest, and added that he still could not believe he was doing business with such a youngster. Then the two said goodbye. Evening arrived, but life in the village house did not slow down, and the boy was full of ideas he wanted to try before spring, starting with making soy sauce and miso paste. By modern standards, the boy can reproduce only 60% of the dishes and hasn't fully mastered cooking yet, but he figures things out through trial and error. Since the village planned to cook all this, the main dish had to be chicken teriyaki with miso soup. They needed a bird, so bundled up, the villagers went hunting for a snowbird. Snowbirds reach about 50 centimeters in length. In the expanded video, their wings span up to 1 meter, and as the name implies, their feathers are pure white. Still, the villagers loved meat. The thought that even in winter, when most animals hibernate, he could eat delicious meat and share it with Murai brought a smile to his face. Snow fell in large flakes, and the boy kept thinking he hadn't met a single monster the whole way, maybe because it was winter, and at least it was very beautiful because of her. The activated detection spell suddenly signaled someone nearby. Hiding behind a tree, a stool peeked out to look around. A snow-white bird with delicate, graceful contours appeared before him, and he admired it without meaning to. One look made the boy forget his goal. The snow bird in front of him seemed like the same kind, but the one staring at him was clearly larger than he'd been told. Suddenly, he heard words in his head, saying his presence was already known, and there was no point in hiding any longer. I wondered if it was his imagination, if the bird was really talking to him, and who she was, because the whole situation reminded me of something, but the village paid no attention to it. The village stood beside a huge bird. Atul looked at the bird, smiled, and gave his name. The village was bundled up for winter as snowballs fell from the sky. The bird smiled at the village and told him the village was very interesting, and the boy was polite. She had never met anyone like him before, and her soul thought that intelligent beings really exist. The birds spread their wings and bobbed their heads. Each had a tuft. A strong aura rose around one bird, and a soul sensed how much stronger that bird was than him. Atul frowned and worried that if he did something wrong, the bird could deal with him in an instant. The bird smiled and said she felt the village's anxiety, but he had nothing to worry about. Atul and a bird stood in the snow among the lush trees. The village said the bird was probably called Snowy. The bird looked at the village and replied that he was wrong, saying she represented the Luca. The village began to wonder about the bird's origin. The village's face flushed slightly. He smiled nervously and said the bird was probably just a legend, like a mythical creature. The bird looked at the village and replied that the village was right and that she was one of them. Sweat ran down Ahul's face as he smiled nervously, thinking he was lucky he hadn't attacked the bird. Then the Ahul replied to the bird that he had guessed it right away. Atul raised his hand, stepped to the side and smiling, signaled that it was time for him to leave because he did not want to bother the bird anymore. The bird closed its eyes. Atul started to leave, then stopped abruptly and grew nervous when the bird turned to him and asked him to stop, while snow continued to fall on the ground and on the branches of the trees. Sweat ran down Asul's face as he turned nervously to the bird and told her he could help, and the bird looked at the village and said she sensed a power there beyond his years and that he still needed to learn more about himself. The bird opened its wings again, then it said it was interested in the village and from that moment would watch the village closely. Atul stood to the side, his face reddening and his mouth opening in surprise. A mouth formed on the village's face. The village began shouting nervously for the bird to explain what the bird's words meant. The bird looked at the village with suspicion and said the village might have objections. The village started sweating even more. Atul lowered his head and said the bird could do whatever he wanted. There was nothing special about him. The bird lifted its head and said it would decide for itself. Snow kept falling on the ground and on the branches of the trees. The bird spread its wings and said it needed to get smaller so it would not draw people's attention, and the village should pick a cute name for it. A fool smiled, thinking the bird was very excited. Atul smiled nervously and said he could give the bird the name Haku. The bird looked thoughtfully at the village. They were silent for a while. Then the bird lifted its head and laughed, saying the village had come up with a good name. Shrinking several times, the bird ended up on the village's shoulder. It looked at the village and told them to call him Haku from now on. A soul looked at the bird in embarrassment. Then the villagers offered to go home. The bird smiled and replied that she couldn't wait to see what the human children were doing. Atul put the bird on his shoulder and they walked on. Then he looked at the bird and said it might be having fun, but Hakus should not speak in front of others, and Hakus replied he understood and would behave like an ordinary bird around people. Lu and Haku were at home when the village warned the household that he was back, and a large bee suspiciously approached the hakak and stared at him menacingly while Haku watched in fright, sweat dripping down his head. The bee flew into the village and began saying he should explain who had come with him. Akul waved his hands nervously and replied that the bee had misunderstood everything. Soon Haku moved closer to the bee and they stared at each other. The bee glared at Haku. A nearby soul noticed and was surprised. The bee hovered in front of Haku, and the bee and Haku stared at each other in silence for a while. A soul stood between them and nervously thought the two might be communicating that way. After a while the bee flew away from Haku, and he closed his eyes and shook his tuft in different directions, his face red as he watched carefully. Then Haku looked at the bee and told Atul that he had spoken to the bee and explained everything. Soon they might even become friends. The village began to rejoice at the good outcome while a fire burned in the fireplace. Haku looked at the village and said the bee was crazy about it. Then he looked at himself in surprise as a bee flew up to him, and he said he was surprised and that the bee was very cute, standing not far from the others with his eyes closed. Snow kept falling outside as the villagers started imagining everything about Haku. After a while, a sunny day arrived and snow lay on the trees. Near the plowed field, shopping carts lined the street as merchants offered a variety of clothing and local residents examined the items with interest. A few fools in Mir walked side by side. They stopped in front of Lebrant and smiled, wishing him a good day. Lebrant smiled back and said they had not seen each other in a long time. They had matured a lot over the winter. Lebrant and the others talked about how few people come to the market in winter, but how it improves in spring. Myril raised her hands and showed different dishes. Then she said the village cooked many tasty dishes. Ahu was embarrassed. Atul said he had not brought food today. Suddenly, a glass bottle with a beautiful lid appeared. Inside it was some liquid. A strange magical light shone from the bottle. Lebron and Mir eagerly examined the bottle of liquid. Mir wondered what kind of beautiful bottle it was. Lebron said it was real glass. You rarely find anything elegant anywhere. Maybe Lee Tool could tell you about the contents. The duelist opened the bottle and poured a few drops of its contents onto his hand. Lebrant and Mary watched in surprise. The duelist said he had been trying to make a healing potion and had obtained the liquid by chance. A.O. turned to Murray and told her to be patient for a while. He pressed his palms, wet with liquid from the bottle, against Murray's face. Murray was slightly surprised by the village's actions. Liquid soaked into Myril's face as she stared ahead in surprise. Soon her face began to shine. Alul said it was a skin care lotion that moisturizes the skin and leaves it smoother and more radiant. Lebrant took the bottle in his hands and said the village had created something incredible. Any lady would be delighted with such a product. Atul gave a nervous smile. Then he said he could and asked whether Lebrant could guess the cost of the lotion. Lebrant rubbed his chin thoughtfully. The men began discussing that the village would sell 100 vials and then stop there. Lebrant spread his arms and smiled, saying the village already knows what may happen because of the demand, so he accepts the village's offer. A soul smiled back at him. Behind him was a plowed field. The men stood on the road. By the shops, they waved goodbye to Lebrant. Someone offered a bag of coins, believing he had earned 10 gold coins for a bottle and could keep earning from its sales. The guys found themselves in the forest. Mew raised her hand high and said that the further they would study. Anul smiled and replied that they could go into the forest and start picking potatoes. The men ended up in a potato field ringed by forest. Myri grabbed some sticks and started waving them. Ul kept picking vegetables, confident he had nothing to worry about and that he had decided everything for himself. 2 months passed and the village became too noisy. Residents gathered on the street and began to discuss why the aristocrats had come to them in such large numbers. One person stood in the crowd staring nervously ahead. Lebrun stood before the village, sweat on his face, lifted a hand and forced a nervous smile as the aristocrats waited at the gate, carriages behind them and beyond that only forest and mountains. Sweat ran down Sewell's face as he frowned, thinking Lebrant could not withstand the nobles' onslaught and had brought them here, and they apparently liked the lotion and other items Sewell made, so he wanted to leave as soon as possible to avoid suspicion. Smiling, Lebrant opened his arms and apologized for arriving late, then said he had brought many goods to sell to the residents, who listened attentively to his story. Residents started whispering that Lebrant was trying to ignore everything that was happening and wondered what to do next. Sweat ran down Lebrant's face as he looked nervously at the village and kept insisting a gentleman wanted to see the man who sold him new goods, but he warned them the visitor was mysterious and they would not find him. The tool thought Lebrant was trying to shield him, so he decided to act like a child and not attract attention. He raised his hand and, smiling, said his mother had asked him to buy soybeans as soon as Lebrant arrived. Lebrant glanced nervously at the village and smiled, saying they really hadn't seen each other for a long time and that he was grateful the village bought his goods. A soul smiled nervously back at Lebrant. When everyone fell silent, a girl stepped out of the carriage and abruptly called Lebrant, making him and Atul grow more nervous. The girl stepped out of the carriage and said she could tell him about the child. Lebrant replied nervously that Asul was only a village boy. Asul looked at her eagerly and thought it really was Mrs. Moore. Chul imagined a beautiful castle with tall towers. He then thought Mrs. Moore was married to the count who owned those territories. Very clever and a powerful magician, she truly matched her status. The vendor showed several bottles and assumed the woman followed every fashion trend, fixated on her looks and likely here for the lotion. The woman leaned toward a villager and asked him about soybeans. Atul picked up the bag and said with a smile that his mother would make a seasoning from soybeans. Behind the village lay a forest and plowed fields. Then drops of sweat appeared on Asul's face, and he realized he had spoken without even thinking about the answer. Lebrant stood beside the woman, sweat beaded on his face, and with a nervous smile he said the pasta was actually made from these beans. Mrs. Moore's face darkened as she glared at Lebrant and told him not to interfere when she talked to the child. Lebrant approached the village, sweat on his face, and nervously said he was sorry for the misunderstanding. A presence stood beside him, and he shrank, feeling afraid. Atul held a bag of beans and said Mr. Lebrant was not lying. Many people in their village used those beans for pasta. Moore looked at Adwa with suspicion, then touched her chin and saw the village had not lied to her. Atul began to think he had not imagined Mrs. Moore using magic to find out if he was lying. Moore closed her eyes and said she hadn't known soybeans were used like this before, though it was a curious method. Miss Moore leaned over to the village and said, smiling, that she was grateful for his time. Atul looked at Mrs. Moore's face in surprise, and an unusual atmosphere arose around them. She turned abruptly and walked toward the carriages where people were standing. Her companions followed the wagons. Lebrant pressed a hand to his chest, sweat running down his face, and he looked into the distance before exhaling calmly. A soul stood nearby, watching the gentleman leave. Mrs. Moore scanned the guys and thought about it. Lebrant put his hand on his chest and, nervously relieved, began to smile. Asul looked at him and smiled too. The girl looked at the village boy's smiling, ruddy face and thought he definitely did not look like an ordinary child. Atul caught Mrs. Moore's gaze and looked at her in confusion. The girl looked down, thinking the village's body held an abnormal amount of magic that he was hiding. It was the village that Lebrant was trying to hide from everyone. The girl pictured the village and kept thinking it could not hide forever. With a huge amount of magic yet still an ordinary farmer's child, she looked suspicious. The village's face flushed red, and he laughed, thinking he was lucky this time. Starting tomorrow, he could continue to enjoy his carefree life as a farmer. The next day arrived. A soul walked through the forest, stopped, glanced over his shoulder, and felt someone watching him from the bushes. No one in the village could make out the face of the man watching him, and someone working in the garden thought the watcher must have been sent by Mrs. Moore, who was serious and would not give up, and that was a fact. Atul remembered the pretty faces of his bee and Aku, who were hiding in the bushes. Aku thought he could not use magic and asked Bee and Aku to hide for a while. Smiling, he took water and began to carry it. He decided he needed to live like an ordinary farmer because he has relied on magic a lot lately. Giving it up will help him enjoy everyday life. 2 more weeks passed. The village was not far from his house. A man was chopping firewood with a large axe and, tired, began to wipe his sweaty face. Atul stands in a forest thicket, narrows his eyes, notes he hasn't felt followed for several days but checks anyway, putting his hands at his sides to cast detection magic. Flickering lines appeared around the village. Closing his eyes, he thought 2 weeks did not seem very short to him, but Mrs. Moore apparently did not have the patience to wait that long. Haku and Abhai suddenly appeared behind the village and started shouting his name. From fright, Kul blushed and screamed. I put my hands in front of him and shouted that he had told Haku and B not to come out until he said so. Haku said it was not important now. They might be watching him, and they had come because the situation was out of control. Atul stared at Haku in surprise. Haku turned his back on the tool and told it to use spatial vision to mount Azare immediately. Asul stood before the mountain, spread his arms, and began to conjure, and at that time villagers believed the range sat on the outskirts of Onan, with monsters from ranks A to D at its base, including dragons. Atul was frightened, and Haku looked at him and said the village finally understood everything. Then a radar filled with dots appeared, and the tool thought he saw a horde of more than 100 monsters. The village was filled with armed, enraged monsters. They were everywhere on the ground and in the air. Atul believed they were all heading straight for the village. The villager's face was full of horror as he looked at Haku and said this was a very bad situation. Haku agreed the village was right, but said the threat did not affect only the villagers. B hovered above as Haku looked at the village and said he and the bee would protect the ancient inhabitants. The village's duty was to defend their home. Sweat ran down the ruler's face. The ruler listened nervously to Haku's suggestion. The tool could not cope with the horde of monsters, and Haku pictured the coming darkness over the village and said it would manage, but in the worst case the village could be wiped out, and Haku frowned as he considered that. Atul clenched his fists and stopped panicking. Haku looked at the boy and said the village had grown more determined, and he could see it. They had little time left. They were heading to the village, and it should do everything in its power. Atul ran out of the forest and finally said he would do his best. Haku and the bee flew the other way. Haku replied to the tool that in that case they would not say goodbye. Atul found himself at his house. While he was running, he thought Haku and bee could save other villages. He still needed to do something else. With all his strength, a stool forced the door open by hand. When the stool ran into the house, he began shouting loudly and calling for his parents. The parents stood at the edge of the village, shaken by their son's sudden appearance, as villagers shouted that a horde of monsters was coming down from the sacred mountain and would destroy the village unless stopped. Sweat ran down the parents' faces. They looked at their son in fear and said the village was not joking. The villagers kept shouting that this was not a joke. The villagers had to be evacuated immediately. The father looked at the village in fear. The village elder frowned and said the situation was urgent. Someone cut him off and shouted that he would go to the village and that mom and dad should leave this place. Atul walked away from his parents, apologized to them, then suddenly ran away from home, and the village parents watched in alarm and called his name loudly as he ran. Atul ran away from home. Squeezing his eyes shut, he began to think his parents should forgive him. They would probably be very angry with him, but he could not do otherwise. After a while, the village sat on a hill. He watched it with a serious expression. Imagining the fire, he realized that while the parents evacuated the residence, he had to act. A cool figure raised his hands and began to conjure. Atul held his hands above him, and after a while, a huge explosion erupted in the sky, while magic continued to emanate from the hands of the village. Atul stopped conjuring. He turned around abruptly, sure Mrs. Moore's subordinate was still in the village and would definitely pay attention to the distracting explosion. Atul fixed his gaze on the mountains. A horde of monsters rushed from there, raising dust as their feet and paws churned the ground. Looking closer, the tool saw many different monsters rushing toward him, their mouths open and some of them armed. Atul looked at the furious faces of the monsters and thought he knew there would be many of them, all looking the same and wild as they ran down the mountain, as if afraid of something. Atul remembered the monsters it had seen earlier and wondered whether those monsters had come down the mountain for the same reason as these. Then the tool spread its arms and shouted that it had no choice. It would have to use magic to save the village. Errol stood on the ground, raised his hand, and began to conjure. A tornado rose from his hand into the sky. Christmas trees grew up around the village. Villagers raised both hands and summoned a slicing tornado, whose gusts cut into the bodies of the approaching monsters. The tool kept conjuring, and gusts of wind battered the monsters, sending pieces of their bodies and their armor to the ground. Sweat ran down Towel's face. He struggled to catch his breath. The trusted monsters lay in front of the village, some with their limbs snatched away. Sweat ran down a calm face as he breathed hard and stared at the monsters. Then the calm man closed one eye and said he had managed the first squad. The village stood on the ground, with the bodies of the affected monsters lying beside it. A soul took a fighting stance and looked ahead to the hill, where another horde of monsters was approaching, dust rising into the air from the oncoming horde. Sweat covered Julo's face and fatigue left bruises under his eyes, and he stared ahead thinking there were too many monsters, and that if they kept attacking, he would not be able to defeat them. Tensing, the Asul raised his hand and began to conjure. Magic in his palm started to glow. He shouted that now was not the time to complain, because he was casting his strongest spell. Tool kept holding his hand above him as he cast a spell called Thunderclap. Many bolts of lightning struck the monsters on the ground. The monsters began getting electrocuted by the lightning. When the spell ended, many monsters lay charred on the ground. Those still alive stared at their trusted kin in fear. The village sat on a small patch of land, not yet covered by the bodies of trusted monsters, and another horde of monsters was now moving toward it. The village's face glistened with sweat as it launched another magical thunderclap attack, and in the next instant, the crowd of monsters advancing on the village was struck by many bolts of lightning. A field in front of the village lay strewn with charred monster corpses, and more monsters kept approaching from the distance, some of them armed. Sweat ran down his cool face and his hair was disheveled. The cool man looked at the monsters' bodies and said he had really done a good job. Armed monsters began appearing in the field. The village lay in ruins with a large stone beside it, and Asua braced his hands on the ground, bowed his head, and said things were bad and he had almost no strength left. Moments later, terror showed on the villagers' faces. The loud roar of some creature terrified him. Atul lay on the ground. Looking up, he saw a huge dinosaur standing in front of him. The dinosaur growled loudly and scanned the surrounding area. Behind him and at the dinosaur's feet stood other creepy monsters. Atul was horrified. It looked at the monster and thought it was an imperial dinosaur. They had died out long ago, and he had a rank. This monster could destroy an entire village. The monster opened its toothy mouth and let out a loud growl. In the next instant, it aimed its prey toward where the village stood. Someone also opened his eyes and mouth wide in surprise. A device raised the barrier instantly, but the monster broke through it easily and knocked Atul aside. The village head's hat flew off from the impact. A monster lashed its tail while a soul flew through the air, blood spraying from the soul's mouth. The soul collapsed to the ground and screamed in pain. Clouds of dust hung over the village. He pushed himself up from the ground and moaned in pain. As he lifted his head, a soul began to wipe the blood from his face. Atul stared at the huge monster in front of him. He realized his situation was dire and his strength was nearly gone. There was no certainty his magic would affect the dinosaur. All his magical energy had been spent on thunderclaps. He could not survive without magic. Moments later, Dinosaur Clawed Paul rushed toward the village. Paul decided to attack the village again. A sewer stared at the dinosaur's paw in fear. The dinosaur's attack was instantaneous. Atul looked at the dinosaurs, and Claude Paul thought the attack was too fast for him to dodge. Atul fell to the ground, but he was unharmed when Haku appeared in front of him, and the dinosaur just in time to repel the monster's attack, and both the monster and Haku were surprised by Haku's sudden appearance. A bee appeared in front of the royal dinosaur's muzzle, attacked it with flashes of light, and the owl looked up in surprise. Haku's muzzle and the bees were alert and serious. They hovered in the air and stared at them. A soul began shouting the names of Haku and the bee. Smiling, Atul told Haku the guys had arrived on time. Haku apologized to the village for being late. Haku and the bee flew up and told Atul they would help handle the monsters, and Atul would have to face the dinosaur. Moments later, Haku and bee charged the monsters and attacked from every side. The monsters tried to fight back. Smiling, the Atul said that, as expected of the legendary Luff Bird and the Bee Queen, they would certainly handle the monsters. Atul looked at the dinosaur and shouted that he would be the dinosaur's opponent, causing the monster to attack him at once and turn toward the village, baring its teeth in anger. Without hesitating, the monster ran toward where the village stood and growled loudly. Rocks appeared under the dinosaur's paws. The Atul took a fighting stance, ready for the monster's attack. The Atul believed the monster had once managed to catch him in the passport. As the monster approached the village, someone dodged and jumped aside. At the same time, a bystander thought that if he focused on the monster, he would notice it was not moving so fast. Atul closed his eyes and focused on magic, and his hair began to grow while bubbles formed around him. Then he put his hands forward and fired a water machine gun at the monster. Water droplets splashed over the monster's body as it stood in the water. It turned toward the village and growled loudly. It struck with its tail, but Atul dodged and judged the monster's scales too dense for the attack to work. The Asul hovered in the air while the dinosaur kept striking. It dodged, launched water attacks, and realized the salt attacks were not useless. The monster stood facing away from the village. Its tail kept waving. The village hovered in the air, dodging the monster's attacks. The village hovered in the air, and ahead of it was a dinosaur's tail. A stool closed his eyes, put his hands forward, and began launching water attacks repeatedly. The village then passed over the dinosaur's huge head. Villagers kept surrounding the dinosaur and firing a water machine gun at it. The dinosaur swung its tail to strike them, but it had no effect. One onlooker thought it was obvious he stood no chance against the dinosaur. The tool started to smile, realizing he was having a great time. He never expected fighting such a powerful opponent to be this enjoyable. Water ran down the monster's body as he looked ahead and growled loudly. The monster glared at a soul standing on the ground and taunting it, and the soul grinned, thinking he would use water attacks against a rank monster. A tool hovered in the air as he held his hands out and began forming ice bullets. Ice crystals flew toward where the dinosaur stood. The dinosaur raised its muzzle and let out a loud roar as the monster slowly became covered in ice. The water on the monster started to freeze. After a while, the monster collapsed to the ground, and clouds of dust rose into the air. The tool pictured dinosaur silhouettes and smiled, thinking that as soon as the cold sets in, reptiles cannot move, and since dinosaurs are that type of reptile, the monster was clearly not ready for that outcome. Tool closed his eyes. Putting his hands forward, he began to conjure. A flickering circle began to appear between the hands of the village. Pool pictured Vector and thought he was using lightning magic and an iron coin as a guide. The village's appearance changed, becoming resolute and formidable. Asul held his hands before him as magic gathered in his palms, and he said the monster would now come to an end. A duel held his hands in front of him and launched an ultra-electromagnetic charge. The jet of energy struck the dinosaur directly. Lightning wrapped the monster's body, and it opened its toothy mouth as its tongue began to stick out. Atul held his hands before him. The bright flash of his magic slowly faded. The village's attack tore a hole through the monster's city. Sparks of electricity ran through the monster's body, and dust clumped around it. The monster lifted its head, opened its mouth, and made a low, horrible sound. Blood and smoke oozed from the wound in its head. After a while, the monster staggered and collapsed to the ground. When it hit the ground, a column of dust rose into the air. A tool stepped up to the monster's head. Sweat ran down the tool's face as he wiped it with his hand. The tool stared in surprise at the hole in the monster's head. The soul collapsed to the ground, sprawling with arms and legs splayed, and while lying there trying to catch his breath, he closed his eyes and said he was having difficulty defeating the monster because his strength was nearly gone. Haku and Abhai arrived at the village. They told someone he had done a good job in the fight. They didn't expect anything less from Haku. Atul blushed with embarrassment and thanked the guys for their praise and for dealing with the other monsters, and Haku smiled and said the village had nothing to worry about as he and the bee had handled everything. Haku rose from the ground and declared the battle over. Haku and the bee rose into the air and flew away. A view of the spruce forest and mountains opened up behind Haku. The parents from the village stood on the small road leading to the house. Front gardens lined both sides of the road. Plowed fields lay behind the house. The village was on the other side of the road where the parents were standing. Atul waved his hands cheerfully and greeted his parents. The parents were very happy about the village's return. Atul rushed to his parents and they hugged each other. The parents in the village hugged him and rejoiced, cheerfully calling the village by name. The tool's father smiled and the tool's mother had tears of joy. She said she had a lot to say, but first she was very happy to have him back, and he lowered his head and began to apologize to his parents. Darkness fell over the village family's roof. Asol's father walked up to him and said they no longer had to worry about the monster invasion. The father described the horde of monsters and said the procession was called the Migration of Monsters. The villagers took refuge in the headman's house. Someone said there was nothing to worry about. The village elder smiled and said he had not known his son's strength. Asol smiled back at his father. Atul blushed and nervously touched his hat. He began to tell his parents he had a blessing and that he trained a lot. He touched his hat again and looked away. The village parents watched him closely. The parents laughed loudly and said they hadn't known the village had such a powerful blessing, but he shouldn't be so reckless. Asul looked at them and smiled nervously. The parents kept saying it was better to keep such power secret from others to avoid unnecessary problems, and the village elder smiled and said he would go to the headman and that the villagers and the mother should wait here for him. Atul smiled and said he could go with his dad. The father began to leave and, smiling, said he would cope on his own. The headman could go out because everything was already over. A few days later, a knight in armor arrived in the village and held up a paper announcing that a son and his father should proceed to Margrave Randolph. More soldiers arrived that night and stood in front of the village house. A man and his family stared at them in surprise. He nervously felt his calm was quickly disturbed. The tool looked at his father nervously and began to say exactly what his father had told the headman. His father looked away and said nothing. Sweat ran down his father's face as he explained that at first he had only told everyone to hide, because when he and a soul entered the forest, they saw a horde of approaching monsters. Soldiers walked through a small area scattered with monster bodies, followed by the villagers. A soul remembered how he set off a distracting explosion and thought Mrs. Moore had noticed it. Soldiers started heading for their wagons, and meanwhile the villagers thought that, as a result, an even bigger lodge had caused many problems and left the village with a bad presence, and one soul climbed into a cart with the soldiers and drove to the dupe. After a while, a soul and his father reached a huge, beautiful building with many large windows. The father of the village looked at it in surprise. Once inside the building, a son and his father walked along a large corridor behind the knights. There were a lot of girls standing by the walls who were dressed in maid costumes. Atul and his father found themselves in one of the building's rooms. They sat on carved chairs with a round table before them. They were very nervous and exhausted from the trip. Frowning, he realized that, as expected from the Margrave, the decorations were far grander than their farm. It was a completely different world, and he could only dream of such luxury. Atul closed his eyes, then looked at his trembling father, felt very nervous, and thought his father seemed more tense than he was. But a girl stood in front of the village, holding a tray and setting cups on the table. A soul thought she might be a maid, but the girl had cat ears. When the villagers thanked her, she smiled shyly. Turning, she began to leave. A soul realized it was the first time he had seen a beastman. Her ears must be very soft to the touch. Atul's father looked at him and said sheepishly that he thought this girl had such a soft touch. The Tool looked at his father in embarrassment, blinked, and thought his father should be ashamed to say that out loud. A man in a suit appeared behind the village. It was really, he said, the first time the village had seen a beastman. One person did not expect the man's sudden appearance and was scared. Someone frowned, opened his mouth in surprise, and began to turn toward the voice. The man in the suit laughed and said he wondered why the villager looked so strange and whether he had scared him. Atul frowned, thinking he should be careful because the man had appeared so suddenly. The man bent down and introduced himself as Gimin Laurel, the head butler, and Atul's father nervously introduced himself in response. Cautiously, the Tool examined the man and decided that to reach such a status, a person must be unusual, and he had heard this surge somewhere before. Walking to the door, the man looked at the others, offered to escort a soul and his father to the gentleman's office, and apologized for the long wait as the soul and his father watched and listened attentively. Soon the group found themselves in a room of the large building. The study had fine wooden furniture and a large window. The butler said the meeting would be held there and that he would call the gentleman at once. A blond, bearded man entered the room and apologized for being late. A soul and his father sat on the sofa, a wooden table with a tea set in front of them. The soul's father looked at the man, visibly nervous. Smiling at the men, he introduced himself as Randolph von Aristal, the one the king had made Margrave, and said the guests must be Poole and his father, Lart. Sitting opposite the village and his father, the man smiled and said the guys probably already know his name and that he would like to discuss the recent incident with them. Sweat ran down Awdal's father's face. He wasn't smiling yet. The village sat silent and watched the man. The duke said he wanted to get straight to the point. Frowning at the men, he said they had been the first to see the approaching monsters and asked them to describe it in more detail, while the village elder was very nervous and the village smiled sweetly at him. Sweat ran down the village's father's face. Nervously smiling, he said that the moment he saw the monsters, the first thing he did was inform the headman. The man put his hands on his feet and said that the father of the village was just a farmer, so he took his child into the forest. Atul's father nervously said they had run out of medicines, and Atul helped collect herbs for them, and sometimes they go hunting in the forest. Atul felt that practicing questions and answers with his father had not been in vain while the conversation went smoothly. The man touched his chin, closed his eyes to think more, and the father of the village watched him sweating. He frowned, admitting some logic in their words, but suspecting they were hiding something, then suddenly said it might be their fault that the procession happened, and that the village elder and the whole village were very frightened. The father of the village put his hands in front of him and said nervously that the man was wrong, insisting he could swear by anything, but that they were not to blame for anything, while Cool stared thoughtfully ahead. Silence hung in the office for a while. The man thought that would not be enough to convince ordinary hillbillies about monsters. The farmer's son being so calm is suspicious. The son is probably hiding something. The man pictured a battlefield full of monsters, reported no damage, and the magician who inspected the scene concluded lightning magic had been used. The village elder opened his mouth in surprise, then turned to his son while someone sat silently and listened to the man's story. Atul looked away, closed one eye, and felt he was pleading with his father not to stare so openly. Frowning, he looked over the village. He said an extraordinary magician had fought. The villagers refused to tell him anything. One soul sat in silence. He thought Moore had told him about meeting an unusual child. Atul lowered his head, his face went suddenly red, and he said he was so scared at the time that he remembers little. The man pointed to the elder's house and said it was strange that everyone hid there that day, while the village itself could not be seen. The man stared at the village, thinking he had lied. The village grew nervous and decided to put more pressure on him. Atul replied that he was so scared he hid from everyone. The man pressed his hands together and said someone had told him the village was in the forest during the monster attack. Sweat trickled down another man's face as he looked at the man anxiously. The tool would not look at the man. The man thought the tool was trying to look away. It was clear the man was hiding something. Then the man glared at the village and said the village was hiding something. The village became very scared. The tool began to close his eyes as darkness slowly filled them. He thought fighting monsters was easier than sitting through interrogation, so he needed to figure out how to get out. The tool's father was sweating and felt faint. The tool squeezed his eyes shut, sweat trickled down his face, and he thought this was really the end of his quiet life. Then the door opened and a woman's voice sounded, a girl shouting Randolph's name. Mrs. Moore stood there. The girl's hair hung loose and she wore a beautiful dress. Miss Karina had an unusual air about her. The mistress told Randolph to explain what was happening. Atul stared ahead, his mouth and eyes wide with fear, as he realized that Mrs. Moore had entered the office. Frowning, the man turned toward Mrs. Moore and called the girl by name. Atul sat silently on the couch and looked at the girl. Mrs. Moore glared at the man. The man said with a smile that they were only discussing important matters. Moore turned completely gloomy. She approached him and said he should shut up immediately. Filled with guilt, the man lowered his head and said he would obey Moore. A soul, hearing his words, opened its mouth in surprise. Moore pointed at the man's face and accused him of pressuring the child. Sweat ran down his face as he tried to explain himself. She frowned more, her finger on the man's nose as she said she had already told him to check everything carefully and not trust his intuition, while someone folded his arms and watched nervously. Moore's face darkened and an evil smile appeared as she said the man deserved punishment and she was ready to step on him. Moore clenched her fists and began stepping on the man, who started to scream with pleasure. A soul and his father watched in fear. Moore turned to a stool and, smiling, said she had apologized to the stool and its father, as the Margrave sometimes does and then thinks, and continued to step on the man's face. Moore stood before the Margrave, smiled, and suggested they forget the misunderstanding and have tea. Someone looked at the girl with confusion and fear. They began pouring tea into the mugs. Moore said that after the procession of monsters, they still had many questions. A soul sat with his hands in his lap and then replied that Moore was right. The village father stared blankly ahead and smiled. Moore came to the village and said he could do magic. A man squinted and said he could do a little. The girl put her hand to her chin and smiled as she thought. Someone frowned and became alert. The girl drank from a cup. Atul held cookies in his hands and looked at Moore. Then he thought she knew for sure he had stopped the monsters. She did not tell this to Margrave. Atul did not understand what Moore had in mind. Atul bit into the song and was startled when he heard Mrs. Moore say that the cookies were really very tasty. Moore peered into the mug she held and said these sweets are a big hit in the capital, but they're hard to find. Someone listened to Moore in surprise. Approaching the village with a smile, the girl said it was very hard for her to get even a basket of cookies and that she wished someone would personally bake them for her family, while a soul looked at her in fright. Atul blushed and stared at Moore's smiling face and thought he understood everything. The lady hinted she would overlook his role in the battle, and the tool was obliged to bake the cookies for her. Atul raised his hands above his head and realized Moore had figured him out, so there was no point in hiding anymore. Smiling with his eyes closed, he said that Mr. Lebrander had also complained that the cookies were not cooked enough. Atul's face went red. He smiled and said he had heard these cookies were hard to cook. Then Atul thought he would not cook that many cookies. Moore smiled and said maybe a merchant would still buy the cook's cookies in bulk. Drooping, Atul gave a nervous smile, smiled again, and said it was worth asking Mr. Lebrant about that man. The tool thought he understood everything. A soul shut his eyes and said it was better to find the cookies recipe. Moore smiled evilly, entered the village, and said Lebrant did not know who the baker was, so how did the village know someone could provide the recipe? Moore said that if Atul knows about that person, then Lebrant is deliberately hiding his identity. The tool went pale, looked away, and grew more nervous. Atul pictured a smiling Moore holding his head in her hands. It then thought he was trapped and would have to dance to her tune, and even the Margrave seemed less frightening than this woman. Moore approached the village's face and, smiling, said that from that day on she wanted to be a friend to the village because he would not mind, and sweat trickled down the village's face as he replied that he would accept such an offer. A soul smiled more. She kept holding his head in her hands. The girl said she hoped their friendship with the soul would last a long time. Atul and his father sat on the couch, and Moore sat opposite them. He said he had brought his father to his senses, and they continued the conversation. Atul thought of Miss Moore and believed they had time to talk about their friendship, and if he created something new, he sent it to her first, because their business partnership should not be interrupted. Atul looked nervously at the smiling Mrs. Moore. The conversation ended when Mrs. Moore said they should definitely remain friends. The cart started to pull away from the beautiful Moore house, as Pud thought Moore didn't seem like a bad person despite following and blackmailing him, and she had also given him a couple of gifts. Atul and his father arrived at their house. Their mother waited for them on the street. She held something in her hands. Atul thought the procession's story ended on that note. The incident did them more good than harm. The father of the village grew very frightened when he saw his wife. A gloomy mood settled around the village mother as she glared at her husband. His wife was angry because he had been staring at the maid with cat ears. Several years passed. It was quiet and peaceful in ancient times. A baby girl sat in a crib with a bib tied around her neck. A soul began saying that this cutie is Siup. Smiling broadly, Atul asked his sister how she was, and the village thought their family had finally been restored. Dole stretched out his arms toward his sister to take her. My mother stood beside me, smiled, and said the village was probably crazy about her sister. Atul replied that Mom was right because she was very sweet, and it thought about his sister's future. Atul clenched his hand into a fist, and smiling, said he would do everything he could to make her life comfortable and carefree, thinking he was doing this not only for her, but also for his parents and himself. Happy parents stood before the villagers because, thanks to the village's efforts, they decided to have a second child. They now needed nothing because their son was pure gold. The villagers' faces turned red. The son was surprised by his parents' words of praise. Atul blushed even more, started smiling, and called his parents. Gradually it grew dark over the Adel family's house. He realized he had not been idle for the past few years. Atul had presented many dishes and felt that, more than anything, Mrs. Moore had helped him. She gave him the ingredients, and because of her, he created many different and amazing things. The village introduced a smoking stove. It had not existed here before. It proved very popular. Someone thought Mrs. Moore really liked smoking cheese. Atul introduced Mrs. Moore, who was covering the fan with her face. The tool believed he was offering more goods for a lot of money and began sharing recipes with her, for which he received a percentage of the sales. The village remembered a busy city street with shops. Atul thought not only that everything was fine with him, and Lebrant opened his store in the capital, where he sold exclusive goods the tool made. Atul pictured his house and a small vegetable garden before him. Grateful for their help, he felt he could no longer be called a poor farmer and was simply enjoying a rural, carefree life. Murray and Owl met. The girl stood at the village entrance with her hand raised and called his name aloud. Murray's face was slightly red, and Owl blushed too, smiling broadly before calling Murray by name. Mir closed her eyes and smiled broadly. A new thought came that she was getting prettier and more like a young girl every day, and Arul sometimes gets nervous when he starts talking to her. Alul's sister and Murray were at the edge of the forest. Alul's sister sat on the ground, happily waving her arms. Alul held out his hands and conjured. Murray stood nearby. The guys began talking about the magic tricks the village owned. Murray approached the village smiling and said the village might teach her something new today. Ogle closed his eyes, smiled, and agreed to Murray's proposal, and a strange atmosphere settled around them. All held his hand out and began to conjure while Myri watched beside him. He had noticed her growing interest in magic and decided to try to teach her water magic because he believed she had the ability. An unusual glow appeared. They were at home and began cooking. Wath thought water magic could help Muri protect himself. Lately, Muri had been helping with the cooking, and his skills had improved. Murray held the knife in her hands. She closed her eyes and laughed loudly. Ahul reflected that Murray often starts a conversation about getting married with Ahul. Those words embarrass Ahul, even though they are very close. Later, Afoul, his sister, and Murray found themselves back in the forest. Afoul summoned a small whirlwind, and the girls laughed. He felt their time together had brought him and Murray closer. That continued until one moment. The village was quiet. The men in the forest agreed their training could end for the day. Myri thanked the village for its help, then handed a letter to Alul. Alul was surprised to see it was from the Margrave's wife. The villager took the letter and read it carefully. From that moment, a series of difficult events began to disrupt the village's carefree life. Mir stood beside him, looking at the letter in surprise. Behind them, the tall tops of the Christmas trees were visible. The scene moves to the capital of the Kingdom of Lead. At the top of the mountain stood a large castle with high walls. Just below the hill lay the city itself. The city spread along both banks of a wide river. The building had beautiful architecture, roof tiles, and a garden of stone figures at its foundation. In one room, a cup with a drink and a basket of cookies sat on the table. Someone was very happy with the liver. With thick hair tied in pigtails, a girl held a cookie in her hands and looked at it. She said the liver is popular right now, sweetness. It seemed to her that this cookie was the most ordinary and no different from the others. Holding a cookie, she brings it to her mouth and takes a bite. After a moment, her eyes open wide in surprise. The girl ate the whole cookie and said it tasted very good. Everything about it, from flavor to size, is perfect. It is clearly different from ordinary cookies. Her cheeks flushed as she turned to the man standing at the door and said she wanted to meet the person who had made the cookies. Albus rested his hand on his chest, smiled, and said that if the lady wanted, he would try to find a man as quickly as possible. The girl wore a dress with dark stripes. She kept eating the cookies. Crumbs covered her face. Then she launched into a monologue. It surprised her how quickly the cookies ran out. She did not understand why everyone likes it. Events take place in the capital of the Laide Kingdom, at the Lebrant Trading House. A small brick house sits on the square, with shops in front and many people walking around the square. Seated at a wooden table with 2 frames and 2 iron cups, Lebrant held the letter in his hands and read it carefully. Lebrant began to sweat and wiped his face as he realized he had just launched a business that attracted the ducal family, the highest aristocracy, and even the royal family to the village. Albus stood at the store counter, raised his hand, and smiled at the seller, and Lebrant remembered that the other day Albus, the Adams family's head butler, had been trying to learn something from the merchants, while several other people were in the square. A horse-drawn carriage headed toward the mountains, and Lebrant decided he needed to meet Mrs. Moore as soon as possible, though it was unlikely they could hide the village from people so serious. Lebrant found himself at Mrs. Moore's mansion. He raised his hand and said the kingdom's noble families were beginning to take an interest in the village. Mrs. Moore put her hand to her face, closed her eyes, and thought. Lebrant sat on the couch while Moore sat opposite him and said the case had taken a serious turn. To protect the village, they had to limit communication with him, and it was for his own good. He asked anxiously if there was another way out. A chandelier hung from the ceiling. Lebrant and Moore agreed the village should not know yet, and Lebrant would write him an explanatory letter. Several weeks passed, and events moved to the Lebrant Trading House. Albus stood at the stalls watching the customers. A merchant handed a small package to a child, and in another shop, a woman was choosing goods. Albus squinted and noticed there were fewer people than the previous week, and that all the shop's goods for sale had disappeared from the counter. A dark, mysterious atmosphere surrounded him. Albus squinted and thought the in-demand items had vanished from the shelves far too suddenly and could not have been delivered by one person. Rumors about bacon reached him, but he did not believe them. There were 2 horses at the end. Albus sat at the bar with a man in a suit in front of him. He thought 10 residents of a single village could buy bacon cheaper than in the capital. Aldred raised his hand and asked the bartender for a bottle of ale. The room was full of tables and customers, and Albus held a mug in his hand. The bartenders said they once had a man from that village and treated him to bacon, and he said it tasted really good. Albus closed his eyes and, smiling, said the bartender might remember the name of the village the man came from. The man put his hand to his chin and thought, then said he would not remember, though the village seemed very strange. A rack stood behind him, its pegs holding various glass bottles filled with liquids. Albus pictured an armed horde of varied monsters. The bartender said an invasion hit the village but was stopped within half a day, and no one was injured because the villagers were protected by God himself. Albus narrowed his eyes and said he had heard about the incident. In the quiet castle on a high hill, he stood in a room full of books and thought the story was just a common rumor because everyone was talking about it. Albus studied a book with inscriptions and a small map, thought there were many possible explanations for what was happening, and found it strange, then said the name of the village of Onan aloud. After a while, Albus found himself working as a merchant at the guild. The man behind the counter said he'd never heard of such a village. On the counter were bills from merchants in more developed cities, and behind it were sacks and wooden barrels. Fluffy clouds drifted above the building bearing Libra's coat of arms. Suspecting someone was shaping the flow of information, Albus went to the Adventurers Guild, where the staff said they had no right to reveal Onan's whereabouts. A man with a scar on his face held a mug and smiled. He replied that there are definitely no hunters in the village of Onan. The food there is delicious and cheap. There is plenty of work. It is a truly wonderful region. The festival will begin there soon. Albus poured a drink into the mug held by the man with a scar on his face. At last, Albus thought he had found a clue. The man with the scar on his face thanked Albus for his generosity. A hooded figure looked thoughtfully at the man with the scar. A large field surrounded by forest held many people pitching tents and carts loaded with various goods. Standing at a merchant's shop, Owl said this year's harvest festival will be fun, and Myril added that residents of neighboring villages take part in the holiday every year. Murray smiled broadly and said she had been helping to set up the village stall for the third year. Azul closed his eyes, smiled, and said he was grateful to her. She always helped him, and they should try hard this year. Several cows grazed in the field. The village expected the harvest festival to last 2 days. A contest would judge the popularity of the stalls. 2 cows would be awarded to the winner of the event. 1 cow costs 50 gold. Stalls went up fast and people worked hard, showing the village's excitement about the prize. Neighboring villages decided to join in too. This year there are twice as many stalls, and the event has never been held on such a scale before. A dark-haired man walked into the village, his forehead deeply lined with wrinkles. Smiling, he asked how things were going in the village. Azul returned the smile and said he was glad to welcome the headman and that things were going well for him. The village's face was slightly red. He asked thoughtfully why the headman had decided to make such drastic changes to the celebration. The headman closed his eyes and laughed, saying it happened because of the village. He held up images of the old village and the new one, and explained that the young people tried to leave as soon as they could, but the villagers' actions led the Margrave's family to start providing benefits, and the village was transformed. Looking at the village, the man said he would hold the competition as a thank you, and everyone was sure the village stall would win this year, but Azul thought it was unfair, so the man began to calm him. The village was noisy. Akul reflected that he certainly loves his region, but he did not do all this to develop the village, and if the headman and everyone else are happy, you just have to accept it. The scarred man stood beside the headman in the village and raised his hand to greet the residents. The headman turned to him and said it really was Mr. Glenn. Mr. Glenn had done a great job, as always. There was an animal in the cart. Closing his eyes and leaning forward slightly, the headman said he had never seen Glenn's escort in these parts before, and that he was the village headman, Maruga. Albus, the butler of the Duchy of Adams, put a hand on his stomach and bowed in response, then smiled and said he was grateful for the hospitality. At the Margrave's estate, someone shouted more harshly that the ducal family's butler had arrived in the village of Onan. She could not let the butler reach the village, so Jane Jammin had to prepare a carriage. The man in the suit obeyed even faster. Moore scowled and clenched her teeth, saying the boy belonged to her, and she wouldn't let anyone take his freedom, clutching a folded fan. Morning came and the harvest festival would begin that day as birds flew over the mountains. A carriage pulled away from the house, drawn by 2 horses. Fields and lush trees stood beside the houses. A long-haired blonde sat in the carriage and said the person who made that sweet treat really lived in a dull backwater. The dark-haired man agreed it was certainly true and there could be no mistake. The carriage pulled up to a 2-story house. Gal said there was nothing wrong with the revenge and that the man would have to bow at his feet to earn the honor of working for Count Filin's second son. Suras said he would need to talk to the headman. Cyrus entered the house, pressed a hand to his chest, apologized for the sudden visit, introduced himself as the butler of Falling County, and asked the owner of the house for a moment. Cyrus glared toward Albus, who stood in the corridor laughing, and said he had not expected to meet the Count's family butler in a remote village, while the floor was lined with wooden planks. Saris looked at Albus and said he was a servant of the Duchy of Adams. Albus closed his eyes and smiled as he said his name was Albus. The men began talking about where the headman was and what they had both forgotten here. Sapirus smiled maliciously and said he was only following his master's orders, though he believed their goals matched Albus's, and Albus smiled maliciously in return and agreed with him. Cyrus said he wanted to speak to the headman, but the headman was not there, so he had to leave. A scarred man entered the house and asked why the Count's family was in the village. Albus said they had probably come for sweets. The men kept talking about the Count's family while a dark cloud gathered above the building, and Elvis closed his eyes, realizing the rumors about the Count's son were true, that the boy craved money and power and even aimed to be a supplier of sweets. Albus opened his eyes and glanced to the side with a serious expression. He said the Count's son would do anything to climb to the top. Albus waited to see what his next move would be. People raised their hands and cheered when the headman announced the start of the harvest festival in the village of One, and flags were placed on top of the newly built tents. Stalls stood close together. Sellers offered various goods to customers. Wooden barrels sat beside some tents. Many guests walked along the rows and looked at the goods. All and Murray stood behind their tents counter with various items on display. A huge line of people waited to buy goods from their children's store. Murray looked at the crowd in surprise, and our soul began to feel nervous. The men smiled at each other and started talking about how many customers they have this year. We must try to serve everyone. Both stood on a market stall selling groceries, while Myril stood in front of the crowd inviting them. After a while it became much quieter and calmer. A man's face was flushed as he wiped sweat with his hand, and the villagers fell quiet and said the number of people had dropped in the afternoon, so they should take a break and have lunch. The count's second son pushed through the crowd, complaining that the shop owner was still making the cookies and demanding they bring them to him at once. Murray and Avel stared at the man in surprise. Murray suggested Avel might know who he was. Avel called him a typical arrogant, foolish aristocrat. The count's second son shouted, waved his arms, and scared people. Murray said the village should not meet this man and she would serve him herself. Coming up behind him with cookies, she smiled and said he might want to buy some, and the man was surprised. Madness filled his eyes. A strange smile spread as he looked at Murray. Murray stared at him in surprise and fell silent. Then he began shouting that Murray was very beautiful and that she would be his wife. Murray was surprised. Spreading his arms wide and closing his eyes, the man shouted that she would become the wife of the head of Philil County, then began promising various things to Mir. Mir smiled and held her hand out in front of her to refuse. Nervously, the man shouted that he wanted to know the reason for the refusal. Murray shoved cookies into his mouth and said no one would cooperate with someone like him, so he could finish the cookies and leave. Villagers stood to one side as nearby residents laughed and watched, and Onul smiled nervously and said Murray had a sharp tongue. The man blushed, clenched his fist, and shouted that the others would still remember him. Ossel and Myril stared in surprise as he walked away. The guests at the stalls laughed at the blushing man. Myril opened her mouth in surprise and said the man had left without paying. Onul laughed and said he was not worth paying attention to. The event went on and many people looked at the shops. A cart pulled by 2 horses was leaving the village. 2 men sat in the carriage. Sedarist shut his eyes and said he could, if the Lord would hear him. The Earl's son frowned and waited for Sedarist to continue the conversation. Remembering the men's smiling faces, the man told Summerset to watch the village, learn who the girl talks to, and find the person she loves. Summerset was ready to carry out his master's orders. The count's son clenched his fist. A cruel smile crossed his face, and he said he would deal with Myri's lover himself, leaving her with nothing left but to fall at his feet. A very gloomy atmosphere surrounded him. A cart pulled by 2 horses stopped at a 2-story house. The count's son laughed so loudly he could be heard across the street. Someone stood behind a tree listening to the count's son and his servant. Albus arrived at the man's shop, raised his hand and smiled as he said maybe Murray was making cookies, and if not he would meet the cook. Murray looked at the man in surprise, and there was a queue behind Albus for the shop. Murray's face went red as she began to explain that an aristocrat had come asking about the village again, but this time he was handsome and polite. He looked like a butler, and Al glanced at Murray in embarrassment, wearing a peaked cap on his head. Atul approached Albus and began to apologize, then realized he had actually made the cookies. Albus said he was sorry for distracting Atul. His sweets tasted wonderful. Atul thanked Albus for the praise. Atul raised his hands a little and said sheepishly he might be able to help Albus with something, and Albus closed his eyes, smiled, and said he only wanted to meet the one who had created such an exquisite product. Atul frowned slightly and looked at the man, feeling the man's words inspire trust while something mysterious ate at him. Atul said that was the only reason the man had called him. He looked at Albus wearily for a long moment. Albus smiled faintly and moved a little closer to the Tul's face, and an unusual tension settled over the group. Albus smiled slightly and said it was rare for such a young boy to understand everything immediately, and that a soul could go with him to the capital. A soul smiled and replied that a boy like him should not spend time with strangers. Albus pressed his hand to his chest, closed his eyes, and said the village seemed to be having a hard time. His name is Albus, the butler of the Ducal Alum's family. People gathered around a soul in Albus. They slowly chose goods from the shops. Bending down slightly, Adul said the man could call him a Sul, but he would have to go to the capital with Albus. Albus said his mistress wished to meet the creator of this popular delicacy in person. Tool smiled, leaned forward slightly, and said he was flattered but unsure this was the right thing. Albus said the trip would be rewarded and suggested starting with 10 gold coins. No one knew how the village would respond. Atul smiled nervously and thought 10 gold coins, 1 million yen, was a tempting offer, then replied that it was tempting but he would think it over, and Alba laughed, saying he understood everything. Albus placed a hand on his chest, faced the village, and said he would live for a while in the village headman's house. If the village changed its mind, the villagers could find him there, but now it was time for him to leave. Asu listened attentively to the man. Albus began walking away from the village, and an onlooker stared into the distance, thinking the butler had truly come to bring the creator to meet his mistress, which looked very strange and made it clear something was wrong. Night fell and a huge moon began to peek from behind the clouds. People kept walking around the market area, choosing goods. A burning lamp was attached to each shop, lighting the trading floor. A two-horse cart waited well away from the trading floor by the elder's house. The duke's son frowned, began shouting that Sarah's had learned about a man named Asal. The trading floor was very bright and noisy. Sarah closed his eyes and said he had found out everything. Asal created cookies, bacon, soap, pita bread, and more. All the main products from the Lebrant house were created by this boy named Asal. Sarons remembered the faces of a wool in Murray and kept saying that the young lady named Murray seemed to sympathize with the wool, and the girl knows all the cooking recipes, so she helps him in production. The count's son looked at Siras and shouted that it was true, saying he might simply deal with the village and take possession of Murray. Siras closed his eyes and lowered his head, then said the gentleman was right. Anger flared on the count's son's face. He stared at Suras and ordered him to get rid of the boy today with no unnecessary witnesses. Surinor looked to his master and was ready to do his bidding. The atmosphere felt eerie. A tall man dressed in black walked beside a cart pulled by two horses, his face hidden by a headdress and a scarf. Angry, the duke's son laughed and shouted that he would rid himself of the boy and claim the woman of his dreams and her knowledge, since today luck was clearly on his side. Alone in the carriage, the duke's son heard a knock at the door, and a voice outside said good evening and asked to speak with the gentleman about the village, so he went out to speak with the stranger. The duke's son stepped out of the carriage, clenched his fists, and looked around. A man said nervously that the stranger should show up and tell him what he needed. The carriage door stayed open, and it was dark outside. Soon the air grew even darker. A black silhouette of a stranger appeared behind the duke's son. The stranger held something and began swinging it at him. The duke's son stood to the side, frowning. A moment later, a loud bang sounded, and drops of blood splattered into the air. The carriage was still open, lit by a bright light. After a while, the village grew very quiet. The residents began to disperse and return to their homes. A dark silhouette of a stranger stood at one of the houses. A plowed vegetable garden lay next to the house. The protagonist lies on his side, sleeping so soundly that drool trickles down his chin, when Russell, looking suspicious, suddenly disturbs his sleep. As he wakes, the hero suddenly remembers he set a detection spell on the house to keep out thieves and now senses someone at the wall. Using spatial vision, the young man notices the stranger holding a weapon in his right hand and concludes this is not an ordinary drunkard, because such people usually do not carry items like that. A man slowly dissolves into the air through witchcraft, becoming invisible to strike first. He will not forgive the one who disturbed his sleep. The stranger who came to deal with the main character frowned because he could not detect him or see his mana. He was very surprised because just a second earlier, the young man had been standing right there. Suddenly, the protagonist appears behind the stranger, leaving him stunned. He asks what the man in black had left outside his house so late. Atul glares at the stranger, indignant and puzzled, and the stranger, frightened by his voice, jumps back and throws his weapon at the young man. The man parries the blades with his strength, spreads his arms wide, continues using magic to increase its power, then strikes back at his opponent. The young man's blow slams into the mercenary's quickly raised shield, but it still weakens the mercenary's legs. Squinting, the young man studies the stranger, concludes he is a magician who dodges easily and uses a shield, and wonders how long the magician will last. The protagonist summons small wind vortices, like mini tornadoes, to test a stranger's strength and endurance. After summoning hurricanes to himself, the young man sends them toward the unknown and shouts a spell as the earth explodes around the stranger. When the young man struck at his opponent and dust rose around them, he thought he had finally hit him, but when the dust cleared, only the killer's cloak lay on the ground. The man picks up the raincoat, a look of chagrin on his face, and carefully examines it for any evidence that could identify the attacker. The main character thinks the stranger has escaped, but still considers the blow worth it. He is sure the man will survive, though he is badly injured and unlikely to attack again. A soul scratches his head, turns around and walks toward the house, thinking he can finally go to bed now. Quiet morning at a house near the mountains is broken by a scream. A man rushes to the screaming girl and asks what happened. She points to the side and, clearly alarmed, says a man is lying there covered in blood. Mir leads a young man to a seriously injured man. A blow hit his head, so he lost consciousness and grimaced in intense pain. Leaning over the man, the main character says he is an aristocrat who recently floated with his friend. The woman replies she thought he was a drunk, which is why he was sleeping, but then she saw the blood. The crowd gathered around the stranger lying on his stomach starts talking among themselves and making noise. The noise worries the young man, so he asks everyone to stay calm. A girl in a voluptuous dress suddenly pushes through the crowd. Claiming to be the count's wife, she tells everyone she will handle the incident, and then he asks everyone to leave the crime scene. A woman who approached them earlier looks at the butler, who spoke to the main character the day before, and asks him to help with the investigation. Mr. Albus replies that he understands, because the Count's son suffered on her land. The white-haired man looks around and says he doesn't see the Philel family's butler nearby, surprising the young man. Atul dives into memories and suspects the person who attacked him at night might be the same butler. Suddenly he feels eyes on him, and McGraw's wife leans toward him and asks him to come over, causing a wave of embarrassment and misunderstanding. She puts her hands on her hips, leans over the young man and says he knows something, asking him to share it. He at first pretends not to understand, then agrees to tell everything. Surveying the room, the protagonist recounts the night incident. The Earl's wife asks if he was attacked at night by the Falali family's butler, and then says there were rumors he once worked as a spy for the crown. The girl leans closer to the village, which is deeply embarrassed by her action, and promises not to reveal how he handled it, but asks him to be smart and help find the culprit, and the guy says they will do everything they can. The butler, still checking the man's body, says he feels no trace of magic, so the attacker must have used a blunt object, and although the victim is bleeding, the wound does not seem serious, so it is worth taking him to the house. A moment later, everyone looks at the wound and notices something odd. The girl in the hat says white powder remains on the unconscious man's head. The young man asks why that powder is needed. Joining the couple who were wondering about their earlier discovery, the butler says they should interview the residents, because the locals may have seen something unusual that day, and the heroine agrees that they need to walk around the village. 3 people investigating the crime walk the streets, asking passersby whether anyone noticed anything unusual last night. The first man blocking the heroes says he was drinking yesterday, so he doesn't remember anything. Some of the men prove useful and say a black-haired butler asked about the friends' relationships and searched every stall for something. Smiling kindly, the butler assisting the investigation asks a visitor at the street market if they have seen a bloody, blunt object. One of the women says she did not see anything. Later, on the gray-haired man's path, a dark-haired man appears and again mentions the figure in black. The butler knows everyone is talking about the Falal family's servant, and he finds it very strange that so many people have seen him. Right now, Magra's wife is asking every villager how they treated the victims and whether he had any enemies. The man finds it very strange that so many people saw him. Blonde girl in a headscarf, expressionless, says the man recently found with a fractured skull acted like the center of the world. No wonder someone tried to kill him. The next passerby, his face full of anger, says the victim was widely hated. Everyone had time to complain about his behavior to the headman, even though he had been in the village for only 1 day. The old man, who also got in the girl's way, called the man injured by an unknown person an uncouth rich boy with more money than sense, and said he annoyed everyone by being there. After summing up, the heroes say they found little information and think it is worth talking to the village headman, who heard all the residents' complaints about the arrogant traveler. The 3 of them went to the village headman. The dark-haired man reported that many residents had come and complained about the stranger's behavior. He had also said he was an ordinary nobleman and had asked the residents not to pay attention to him. No one seemed particularly indignant. The headman says this is his first time holding a holiday for 2 full days, so he wanted to discuss it with Mr. Albus because he does not want it to leave bad memories. Neither the butler nor the main character answer this. The girl asks why the man chose to spend 2 whole days of this year's holiday that way. The dark-haired man tells the woman she must be aware of the village's problem of young people leaving, but in recent years, the population has grown in a way he never dared to imagine. Suddenly, the village headman bows and says the rise in residents happened because of the village's efforts, and his behavior drives the young hero into a rage. Stuttering and spreading his hands, the young man asks the older man to lift his head and says there is no need to thank him. He blurts out that he loves the village as much as a man who keeps his head down. She puts her hand to her face and says sadly that, in the end, they still have no suspect who could have committed a crime against a high-ranking official. Albus closes his eyes, and the blonde young man notices. The young man thinks the village sees the earlier words differently, and that surprises him. Surprised that the butler understood everything, the main character laughs and asks the adventurers to search the village for a crime weapon. Confidently, the young man walks away from his colleagues and says he and the butler should meet the man again and speak to him seriously. McGraw's wife stares at both men in confusion and asks what their actions and words mean, whether they are claiming to know who the perpetrator is. A skeptical look returns to the girl's face as she says Ms. Mule's place is tucked away in an unremarkable corner and nobody saw anyone suspicious, so it's unclear how they figured it out. He admits he dislikes saying this, but he will try to explain everything to his companion. At first, several witnesses deliberately lied to them, he claims. The young man recalls the 3 men investigators interviewed first, who said they had been drunk all night, and says they were the ones who deceived the. Atul continues his explanations and wonders how people can know that Gals was just lying there, bleeding near his house, since they never said exactly when the man fell. The guy notices every witness uses the word night, but it is unclear why they all assume the attack happened then. Out of strong solidarity, the villagers lied. They knew the culprit and tried to keep his name secret even from the nobles. The hero, a simple hillbilly, understands why they did this. Lost in thought, the main character tries to reach a conclusion. He then notes that the criminal is an important figure among the villagers. The criminal introduces himself to every noble when they arrive. If the young man turns to the hunched man behind him and asks the village headman whether he understands what he means. The interlocutor covers his tired eyes, suddenly laughs, and says nothing can be hidden from the main character. With regret in her eyes, the girl asks the elder why he did that. The village head says his motive was simple, because Gals wanted to kill someone and force Macari to marry. The dark-haired man keeps saying he is very grateful to the guy for everything he has done, and because he loves every villager like his own child, he cannot ignore Gel's words. After watching the conversation, Mrs. Mule and the butler asked where the crime weapon was because they couldn't find it. The young man asks whether the tool was a chunk of rock salt and then asks someone to confirm his claim. The headman looks very surprised. The man says he expected nothing else from the main character, then says he was right and that it was rock salt prepared in large quantities for the festival and simply dissolved in water. Confidently, the girl in a hat says they've finally found the weapon used in the crime. The butler laughs, then says the whole truth has now come to light. The countess says she's heard that goblins and orcs have been attacking the village recently and asks if it's true. The headman does not understand what is being discussed. The man says that sometimes orcs come out of the forest in small groups but do little harm, while Miss Mule keeps insisting it was because of them that the weapon and witnesses were not found. With a slight expression, the countess says the wound on Mr. Fallel's head matches the kind made by the batons orcs often carry. Then she looks to Albus for confirmation. Albus lifts his head and laughs, saying it really was just a monster attack. The girl was right, and the village headman is confused by all of it. Mrs. Mule asks the butler to help her compile a report on this crime, and he replies he will handle it himself, saying it is very simple because they have already decided the Marquis's second son was attacked by orcs at night. A gray-haired man gives the girl a sly look and meets her eyes, saying he will grant any whim in exchange for her donations. She says she does not mind, but wonders how expensive it will be. Countess Bowser paused, squinted, glanced over her shoulder, and asked whether the village being sent to the capital would count as payment. The suggestion surprised the young man. The butler says her offer is too tempting to refuse, and the girl adds that she has cared for the village for a long time, so he must repay her in return. The village headman shouts angrily that only he should be punished for the crime. A friendly man with a sly smile says the attempted murder of the count's son is a serious crime, so not only the village head, but also the villagers could suffer. The butler asks the headman for permission to help him in his village and says he will humbly follow their plan, then asks if they understood him. The headman reassures everyone that if the village joins the Duchy of Adams, everything will be fine because its nobles do not care about money or power, a rare trait among aristocrats. There is no better place to live. Even if the main character refuses, aristocrats like Gals will eventually come for him, and the whole village will suffer. The young man stands and says he started all the arguments because he loves the village and its people and feels indebted to Mrs. Mule, so he accepts the proposal. The headman bows his head before the young man again, says all this is happening because of him, and asks him for forgiveness. Atul throws up his hands and insists the village's main character should not bow his head so easily, saying he was thinking of the character and Miss Ree's safety and only wanted to do the right thing. The man closes his monologue by asking once more to avoid harmful actions and resolve everything peacefully. The headman replies with another thank you. The following day it was announced that Marquilla Faltiel's son had been attacked by monsters, and the few villagers who knew the truth stayed silent about what really happened for the rest of their lives. Soon Mr. Gals woke and remembered what had really happened to him, and Mrs. Mule gently warned him that if he tried anything she would remind him what his butler had done. Organizers resolved the incident, and the harvest festival still went well despite what happened. Voting results put the shop owned by Myri and the village in first place. A couple of days later, the main character had to leave for the Duchy of Adams. His parents came to see him off, urged him to eat well, and he promised to bring them souvenirs from the capital. The headman says life in the capital is hard for villagers, but he believes the young man will succeed and that everyone will wait for his return. The young man thanks me for those kind words. A girl he knows rushes up and tells the young man she will try to be a good bride by the time he returns from the duchy, surprising him. From behind, Atul glances at the woman, thinking he will return next spring and not understanding what his mother is up to while she acts innocent. Without warning, Mary approaches the young man and kisses him on the cheek, leaving him standing with his eyes wide open. Holding his cheek, the main character glares at the girl. Embarrassed as well, she says it's her magic charm and it will prevent him from seducing the capital's beauties. Preparing to leave, the young man heads for the gate that leads out of the city, but his girlfriend stops him and says she almost forgot something. She hands him a neatly folded letter and asks him to open it as soon as he reaches the capital. Someone is surprised that Misery wrote him a message. The young man's face shows suspicion because he thinks it's a joke and doesn't understand why they sent him a letter. He assumes his mother is too embarrassed to say it and chose to tell him in a letter. The main character goes to the carriage, stops, and waves to his family and girlfriend, who call after him with wishes for a happy journey. Once the young man sits in the carriage beside Albus, he says that because he's been busy lately, they haven't had a calm chance to discuss why the village is needed in the duchy. The man confidently says he was definitely called to another place, not to rest there, and the butler tells me he is, of course, right. Albus says the young lady wants to eat the village's daily food, so he suggests the main character teach the village chefs all of his recipes in exchange for generous payment. The young man admits he expected this, but insists his goods are clearly high quality, and the young duchess's servant replies confidently to keep him from demanding an excessive price. Mr. Albus had a long talk, taught the young man to drive a carriage, and briefly described the capital and the work he would soon do. As the two heroes neared the duchy, the main character admired her and eagerly told her the capital was huge. At last he opens the letter and says his mother asked him to read the message as soon as he arrived in the capital, so while they were driving he read it aloud. After that, his scream echoed across the field. The opening lines say the mother is writing to her dear son, who must have already reached the capital. The letter is about the village itself. She continues writing that, however you view it, her son is an exceptionally gifted child, and she does not want his knowledge of the world confined to a small village. Her past thoughts led her to ask Mr. Albus for the chance to take the entrance exams for the Ruins Magic Academy in the capital, with admissions starting in the spring. The message says that after 3 years at the academy, he should travel to see the world and earn more money. Mom told the young man about Mariah. Mariah asked Mom to teach her how to be a better wife, so Mom began training her. If the young man finds a better girl, Mom will take care of his girlfriend. Before admission, the young man may remain in the duchy, but once admitted, he can move into the academy dormitory and fully support himself. Finally, the young man understood what his girlfriend had meant when she told him just before she left, but he is also outraged that his family forgot to ask his opinion on the matter. He figured his mother had realized that by agreeing to the trip to the capital, he wanted to enter the Magic Academy and see the world, and he knew she was wise and understanding. Agreeing with all the proposals and seeing that the Duchy of Adams does not seem hostile, he decides to settle in the royal capital for a while. Albus watches the young man beside him, asks whether he has read the letter to the end, and says he hopes they will cooperate long-term. The village confirms that it has apparently been connected with their family for a long time. The butler laughs and says they will discuss admission to the Magic Academy next year. They will arrive soon. The young man is fascinated by how huge the Duke's house is. As soon as the stool enters, all the servants line up before him to greet him. Then he is escorted to his assigned room and later taken to the bathroom. After the bath, attendants lead the main character into the dining room, where he is served magnificent dishes made from a wide range of ingredients. While watching the young man eat, Albus asks if he is happy with his stay at the mansion. The young man cannot find words to describe their house. After eating, the young man is escorted to the young lady, who steps forward, greets him, and introduces herself as Adams von Allestrat, the eldest daughter of the Adam family. The girl apologizes in advance for her rudeness, but asks whether he really made the cookies. A soul apologizes in advance for his rude language and says he is a commoner. A moment later, he hands her a basket of muffins and offers her one to try. She takes a bite of a cookie. The eldest daughter of the Adams family takes the main character's hands and says this is exactly what she needs, adding that she can't believe a child invented it and that she is very glad to meet them. Embarrassed, the young man says he is glad to meet the Duchess, who says she can be called simply Alice and that you cannot speak to her respectfully. The girl insists she invited the hero here, so he is hers, and she assures that her family treats commoners with respect, so they will not demand things he has not been trained for. Looking back at the butler, Atul says that since Alice allows it, he will live in her duchy from that day until next spring, and that he is very glad to meet the young lady. Embarrassed by the young man's words, the girl says he is still too respectful toward her since they are the same age, and he agrees and asks if he may ask her one question. The main character kept asking the question that haunted him throughout the trip, what the young Duchess wanted from him, and she says she had several reasons. At first, Alice says she was naturally curious, wanted to meet the person who had created something new in the confectionery industry, and had a small request. The girl says she wants to ask him to help organize the banquet soon to be held at their estate. The young Duchess promises to cover all his expenses and pay him for taking part, and she wants him to teach his recipes to the chefs in her house, but he can cook everything himself even though her birthday is only 2 weeks away. The protagonist looks at her with indignation and understands why he was brought here and what is really needed from him, but he decides to tolerate it since he will be living here until spring and agrees to share all the recipes. He realizes he needs a cake for a birthday. In the world where he found himself, no one has baked one yet, and he has never heard of cake. The village also believes that with so many chefs available, its capabilities will grow. Realizing his client is the Duchess, the young man decides he can win her favor and even ask her for help, so he sees it as a very profitable arrangement. Nodding slowly, the main character says he agrees with the young Duchess's proposal, and she folds her hands in front of her and looks very pleased. Spreading his hands, the young man says they can discuss the banquet details later, and now asks the butler and his mistress for fresh milk and eggs. Alice says happily they bought a couple of things, including a bag of sugar, at a sale, but the man says not to worry because he can use his own. Those words surprise the Duchess and Albus, and they ask the young man if he really supplied the capital with high-quality sugar. The villagers ask that this information be kept secret. The Duchy of Adam's servant says he will of course keep it secret. Meanwhile, the capital's nobles are all chasing sugar. The girl asks who the young man really is. Smiling sheepishly, he laughs awkwardly and claims he's just an ordinary farmer. After that conversation, the main character's days became hectic. At first, the Duke's kitchen staff treated him with hostility, but once he started working there, they showed him respect. Over time, the kitchen staff grew to admire the young man and came to see him as the head chef. A few minutes later, Alice entered the kitchen, saw the new dish prototypes, and immediately ate them with a satisfied look. 500 guests were invited to the ball, making it a large-scale event. While Atul prepared samples of the dishes, he also served them to the Duke and Duchess, who proved to be pleasant people. They met with Mr. Albus, the cooks, and the servants to carefully plan the dishes for the ball. About 500 guests attended, so we had to carefully decide how many and which dishes to prepare, but planning was harder because some ingredients were in limited supply. The Servants' Council chose an apple pie because there was enough dough and apples, and the servants liked it. Lately, the maids kept coming to the kitchen to ask the hero what kind of girls he liked, but they might have been doing it just out of politeness. The main character told Alice not to come into the kitchen anymore, which upset her, and then explained it was her birthday so everyone wanted to surprise her, but she wouldn't let them. The young chef's days passed, and each day there was less time left before the birthday. With the menu agreed and the ingredients due to arrive tonight, the village had its first day off in a long time. Resting today, the young man first decided to go somewhere. Later, he met Mr. Lebrant, who was very glad the hero had come to the capital. He finished his story by saying this was how he began working for the Duchy of Adams, then said the young man had a hard time and offered to help if needed. The genius chef smiles, pleased that he achieved his goal in the conversation, and says he needs a favor from an old acquaintance. These words surprised the long-haired man. After the conversation with Mr. Lebrant, the young man went to the realtor's office, walked in, greeted the agent, and said he wanted to rent a house. After the birthday, the village and duchy work ended, and though he could stay in the mansion until spring, he did not want to burden anyone and wants to live for himself without being overloaded with work. Living alone in the capital, he definitely needs a house. He calls the realtor again, who says he is already on his way. The agency employee is surprised when a child arrives at his office. The child says he wants to rent a house or a room near the academy, but the employee is unsure he can rent to a child. A man hands the realtor a paper he received in the duchy and asks him to look at it. The realtor, surprised, reads it and realizes how important it is. The agency employee apologizes for being rude and asks for a minute to offer a great option. The man is glad he did not consult Albus in vain earlier. Soon after, a huge two-story house appears before the man, gleaming with luxury and impeccably clean, and he asks the main character what he thinks of it. According to the employee, it's a two-story mansion with 4 rooms, a garden, and only a 20-minute walk from the academy, and most importantly, it has a huge living room, so it is the best option. The young man is surprised by how huge the main room is, about 25 square meters, so a sofa would fit, and he thinks this place is just a fairy tale. The rent for such a gorgeous place is 45 gold per month, and if the village buys it, it will cost about 9,000, so given the house's charms, the hero sees no reason to refuse. The main character hesitates, then remembers the duchy recommended this realtor, so he agrees and buys the house. The realtor offers to go over the contract details. The employee is surprised because he thought the man meant rent, not buying, but the young man pulls out his savings and offers to pay the full amount up front. Soon furniture arrived at the young man's new home, and he began to call it his dream home. He remembered he still had to show the Duke's letter to the man at the furniture store again. Looking around, the young man isn't sure the letter was the reason, but the furniture looks very luxurious because he paid a lot for it. While in the store, he felt nostalgic when he saw a fox mask in the window. She seemed to have come from Japan itself, where the hero lived before his rebirth in this world. The young man only had to keep a house from the cold. Using magic could do it, but it would not look as elegant as he wants. Later, the man enters the blacksmith's shop, sees a huge man working, and apologizes for interrupting him. The bearded man looks back at the young man and says he doesn't understand what a heater is and asks him again what it is. Knowing this technology must not exist here, he sketches how the device should look, surprising the blacksmith with its unusual design. The man asks about the budget to make a heater. The young man says a limit over 100 gold is acceptable. The blacksmith tells them they will use grands, or this special ore comes from the Grands volcano, resists fire well, and is reasonably priced. Building the new device will take 3 days. It can be made of iron, but that will shorten the heater's life. The young man says they have agreed. A man asks his new friend's name, and the friend, realizing he hadn't introduced himself, says his name is Garvance but that he can be called Gar, and the young man replies by calling his name. The young man thinks the day was long enough, but it passed by unnoticed. He believes the items ordered for the banquet should have arrived by now. The young man sees that, as expected from the duchy, the goods are top quality, and he decides to spend the next 2 days trying to surprise the young duchess. The next morning, all the servants began preparations. They started with snacks and prepared the main dishes in the late afternoon. Everyone went above and beyond and had everything ready by the deadline. Now they only have to wait for the holiday. The night before the celebration, after everyone had gone to bed, 3 people in black cloaks ran through the estate's backyard. The maid let them into the house, saying everything was clean. They agreed they had to move quickly before anyone noticed, so they went into the kitchen and to the refrigerator, where the dishes for tomorrow's birthday were stored. A cry rings through the palace calling the village lord, and the young man sees cooks rushing to him, saying something terrible has happened. He rushes into the kitchen and finds it devastated, with pots and ingredients scattered all over the room and everything covered in dust and dirt. The boy tells one of the chefs a nightmare happened, says everything was fine yesterday, and asks what happened here. A man says thieves broke into the kitchen last night. The main character is stunned beyond belief. The cook said knowingly that the door had been opened from the inside, and before bed, they posted experienced guards in the kitchen, but all of them fell asleep at once, and the maid hired the night before the ball disappeared. The ducal house employee keeps saying someone intended to disrupt the ball and is certain of it. The young man asks what the damage is. The man replies that, in addition to food and groceries, the dishes and all the alcohol were destroyed. The young man realizes this is a total failure. The score for the first daughter of the Duchy of Adams will be held very soon, but they have no food or drink, and even as a commoner he knows how terrible the situation is. The man calms down, pulls himself together, and asks Mr. Albus for an urgent delivery of eggs, milk, dishes, and alcohol within an hour. The young man tells the chefs to pull themselves together, saying they still have time since it is only 6 in the morning and the ball starts at midnight. The chefs are stunned because there are no main ingredients. The young man holds his hands out, and to the servants' astonishment, the ingredients they need start appearing out of thin air. The main character repeats that the ingredients are his responsibility and hopes the Adam family's staff remember the recipes. The chef assures him they can cook everything. The guy remembers there were hunting supplies in his vault for emergencies, and since there is no choice, you will have to use them and cook with what you have. He orders the cooks to get to work. They promptly send the servants to fetch the ingredients, then begin cutting food together in unison and good spirits for the upcoming holiday. The The chefs, showing the skills they've built over many years with this noble house, begin cooking the food and then skillfully arrange it on plates. The young man watches everything, but complains that no matter how hard they try, they manage to cook the meat, and he hopes to find a way to reduce the cooking time. Finding what looks like a black baking sheet, the main character grabs it and says this is the solution to all their problems. A moment later, the man shouts that he'll take over all the meat dishes. The chef can't see how he could cook them all alone and says he won't have time. At today's ball, the young man promises to show his colleagues a new way to cook and asks them not to be distracted until then. Suddenly, Mr. Albus rushes into the kitchen, calls to the young man to ask how he is doing, and says he managed to get eggs and milk but couldn't find alcohol or dishes because they were sold out everywhere. The main character asks who could have bought everything, since it is strange that it sold out in one evening. The butler says the Sagusai Trading Company bought everything and has business ties with the Falali family. The young man explains that the man they recently found unconscious near his house was a member of this family. The butler agrees, and he suggests it could be revenge on the Duchy of Adams. The man is convinced it's all one big trap and expects them to appear any moment. A servant rushes into the kitchen and asks Mr. Butler to leave the house because merchants from the trading company have arrived. The young man tells Mr. Butler he will go with him to speak to the guests who have arrived, then turns to the chef and leaves the kitchen in his care. 3 people enter the mansion's main doors. They are surprised to see the head butler himself come to meet them. They say Mrs. Alice's birthday is today, but they have suddenly run out of food, dishes, and alcohol. Standing behind the butler, the young man realizes everything has fallen into place and concludes that the Philo family, rivals of the Adams family, is involved. The man whispers his plan into Mr. Albus's ear, and Mr. Albus asks whether they are the official representatives of the Sahasi Trading Company and waits for confirmation. A second later, the butler says everything is in perfect order and informs them they do not need the merchant's goods, which greatly surprises the 3 men. The gray-haired man then turns and tells them to look for customers elsewhere, causing the people who came to react with indignation and warn that the estate residents will regret it. The uninvited guests leave through the same main door they entered. The butler looks at the young man and says he did as he asked. The young man tells him not to worry and that he will soon understand everything. Suddenly, both heroes hear someone on the stairs, and one of the Adams house servants appears and calls for the head butler. The employee tells them that this time a representative from the LeBrant trading house came to them, leaving the butler stunned as baskets of food and drink appear before him one by one. The gray-haired man asks how he could have known this would happen. The young man says Mr. LeBrant is a close friend, so he asked Mr. LeBrant for a favor. I suspected he would need help. The butler asks if the young man knew such a thing could happen. The young man replies that he was only being overly cautious, nothing more, and complains he could not get the right alcohol. The young man says he recently decided to try making his own wine, which is neatly placed in a wicker basket, and offers the butler a taste. The man says this is unusual because the young man is too young to drink alcohol but still chose to cook it. Then the young man gives him a glass with a drink. The house's chief servant says the wine is very rich, so they will buy his wine in bulk, and the young man accepts the generous offer, adding that they have agreed on it. The men who had earlier tried to sell goods in the house are unsure what to do now, because the young gentleman said they only had to wait a few minutes, and people from the estate would hurry to them. A masked man suddenly hails 3 merchants and offers to buy back all their goods. They do not know who he is. He warns that if they do not sell, the ingredients will quickly deteriorate. A masked man says he'll buy back all their goods for 100 gold pieces. The merchants are outraged, calling it a daylight robbery because the goods are worth about 30,000 gold pieces. The stranger says he does not care how much they demand, but the count gave them the money, and it would be absurd for them to return to him empty-handed. The young man enjoys the merchants' indignant faces as they start to bargain, offering 10,000 gold for all the goods, but he holds out and sets the final price at 300 gold. The strange man in the mask assumed they would agree, but they had actually borrowed money from Count Falil, and the men who called themselves merchants began trudging toward the exit, unsure what to do next. Under the fox mask, the main character realizes the ball will start soon and returns to the kitchen, which is bustling as everyone tries to cook the stolen dishes. The young man rushes into the workspace and apologizes to everyone for keeping them waiting. Then colleagues come up and say they thought Mr. Asul had abandoned them, leaving him embarrassed. A young man asks how things are going. The chef says everything is ready and set out in the hall except the meat dishes. Someone promises to take care of them right away and pulls the tablecloth off an unusual device. A young man puts a piece of meat on the stove he built and immediately starts grumbling. The cook asks what new cooking method the young man wanted to show him. The young man confirms it. Atul calls this method of cooking live cooking because he prepares his dishes right in front of guests, who come closer and closer to enjoy a new sight. The main character puts on a mask to hide his identity as a crowd of guests at the young lady's birthday party begins to gather around him, and he adds a second piece of meat to the stove. A moment later, the young man uncorks a bottle of his own wine and pours it directly over the meat, sparking a high flame. He announces the first steak is ready. A queue immediately forms behind him, and a chorus of voices rises because everyone wants to try it first. The young man's hands flutter over his new device as he quickly cooks the meat so everyone gets a small piece, but Kadir calls out that the guest of honor has arrived. A girl in a beautiful fluffy dress starts down the stairs, capturing the full attention of the gathered guests. Momentarily distracted, she looks toward the center of the banquet hall, where the main character stands frying meat on an unusual device she has not seen before. Moments later, the eldest daughter of the Adam household lifts her hand to a recent acquaintance she's gradually become friends with, and he returns the gesture. Everyone inwardly complains that they, of course, faced some difficulties, but overall things went well. The protagonist heard that many people asked the maids where they got so much delicious food, but the maids replied quietly that only the head butler knew, and Mr. Albus would not betray him to anyone. Watching the butler, tired from the long preparations and the problems that arose, the hero thinks Albus can be trusted to keep the secret. He noticed the desserts were the big hit at the party. They disappeared in seconds. The evening's highlight was the birthday cake made especially for the birthday girl, who had the honor of taking the first bite and clearly enjoyed it. Taking a bite of cake and swallowing, the girl says it is very tasty, tears filling her eyes from the pleasure. The girl gives the main character an embarrassed look, says his name meekly, and warmly thanks the person who gave her such a beautiful birthday. A man congratulated the eldest daughter of the Adam household on her birthday and began clapping, which the other guests soon joined, and that is how the evening at the duchy ended. Night had fallen after the guests left the estate and the party ended, so the young man sat on a couch in one of the house's halls to relax, and the butler approached him. The gray-haired man praises the village for a great job today, and the villagers say that Mr. Albus did a great job too. Then they move on to the fee, taking everyone's cooking and organizing help into account. The butler reports the amount is about 300 platinum coins and asks if the young man accepts it. The family also agrees to pay a fine if at least one of the recipes is disclosed. Mentally, he calculates that 300 platinum coins equal 300 million yen and considers the amount too large. The head servant of the house guarantees that the recipes will change their diet, and this amount includes compensation for the stress caused by a competing family. The butler says the gentleman in his household really liked the wine the man prepared and that they still have 5 barrels left, but the head wants to buy 10 more from him. The young man's gaze goes sly after a moment. He likes that they want to buy back the wine he made. It's a pretty good deal. Smiling, the man says that since they liked his wine, he sees no reason to refuse them the sale, and the butler, pleased by the remark, says he made the right choice. In a single evening, the young man became fabulously rich and secured a permanent source of income, so he now finds his connection with the duchy convenient. The next day, the villagers gather before the ducal family. The head says he is leaving them today. They are grateful for everything he has done, and their family will always help him if he faces a difficult situation. The lady of the Adam family says his desserts were incredibly delicious and asks him to come cook as soon as he has free time, and they also mentioned his wine, saying it was very tasty. Alice says Albus told her what the young man had to go through before her birthday, but she is glad he got through it and is very grateful to him for the holiday he arranged for her. She lowers her head regretfully and tells him it's time to leave. The man does not understand why the Adam family's eldest daughter is so upset. Unable to start a conversation, his new friend puts her hand to her chest and asks the hero for permission to fulfill her wish. Although he's leaving, he still offers to cook sweets for her if she wants, and she readily accepts the generous offer. The little woman takes his hand, squeezes it tightly, and promises she will, of course, come visit him as soon as her cookies are finished. Albus steps outside to say goodbye to the young man, thanks him for his work, and asks what he plans to do. The young man says he doesn't know because he had no special plans and asks for recommendations. The butler pauses for a few seconds and says he usually doesn't offer this because the classes don't suit everyone. Given the main character's abilities, does he want to go to the maze? The butler's words startle the young man, filling his mind with images of a cave full of bones and skulls, and he mutters that it looks like some kind of maze. Archeria has about 108 labyrinths, special dungeon-like places full of monsters where ancient treasures can be found, and many take those risks for profit. One such maze lies just outside the capital. It's maze number 4. The mazes are numbered 1 through 10 based on difficulty. Right now, 53 floors of this maze are open. Only people over 15 or those with an adventurer's license can enter the mazes, but Albus came with the main character, put in a good word for him, and they let him through. The young man stood before a massive road carved through solid rock. Grabbing the first sticky saw from the floor as his weapon, the young man felt he had to see how far he could go. Every 5th floor of the labyrinth has a mini-boss who always guards something valuable, and the hero hopes to defeat more than a few. The young man begins casting a spell, focusing and drawing on his inner strength as he invokes magic to strengthen his body, detect others, conceal his presence, and grant spatial vision. After finishing with his magic, the man starts running toward his goal, shouting that he is moving forward. Moving through the maze, the hero faces his first test. Strange, slug-like creatures crawl out of the stone walls. He fights them off with the stick he picked up at the cave entrance. The main character sees that, as he expected, the enemies on the lower floors are weak, so he manages with a single stick and decides to keep fighting the same way. After clearing 4 levels, the young man reaches the 5th floor and finds the main boss's room, where a mountain troll-like creature stands wielding a huge sword. The young man stares at the figure before him, a huge goblin wearing a crown and clearly the Goblin King, who starts screaming at him. He gathers all his strength, reaches forward with his hands, and releases a magical water spear that pierces the opponent's chest. After the impact, only dust hangs over the field where the battle took place, and the young man realizes the fight is not over, so he takes a fighting stance and asks his opponent to attack. Once the smoke from their fierce exchange clears, the protagonist sees that only the goblin's crown remains and the goblin lies alone on the cave rocks. The young man is amazed by everything happening, finds it strange how easy it was for him, and does not expect to meet intelligent opponents on the top 10 floors. Having defeated the monster, a young man with a joyful gleam in his eyes spots a chest in the corner of the cave, goes to it, and opens it to find a white bag inside. He opens the bag he won, finds small seeds of an unknown plant, and pours them into his hand. A little disappointed, he shakes out the seeds and thinks this maze is a storehouse for farmers, even though he is a farmer himself. Having defeated the monster on the 5th floor, the young man climbs to the 6th and finds a vast, peaceful field surrounded by towering mountains. Lifting his head, he realizes that though he's underground, he can still see the sky and senses a different atmosphere, and assumes the environment changes every 5 floors. This meadow where the main character found himself reminds him of his native village, which he left not so long ago. Seen that way, he hasn't let her out of space since the day he arrived in the camp. The young man frees his magic bee from his arms, names her Quinn, and orders her to fly free. The bee turns to the young man as if greeting him and is several times larger than a normal insect. A soul asks her to sit on his shoulder and says he is glad to see her too. Honestly, the young man thought of leaving his favorite insect in the village, but she refused outright, so he had to take her with him. The young man says he will go down further and asks if Quinn will go with him. Quinn says she wants to fly here, so he says he'll meet her later and asks her to be careful. After a slow, steady climb, the young man reached the 10th floor, entered a room full of monsters like werewolves, and began to fight them. After winning on the floor, a cloth falls onto the young man. Picking it up, he realizes it belongs to the boss and is a cloak which he wraps around himself. A new chest then appears, and when he opens it, he finds seeds inside. The young man goes straight to the 11th floor and finds himself in a swampy area with no bright sun. On the 12th and 13th floors, the young man faces even greater danger, so he confirms that the lower he goes, the tougher his enemies become. On the 15th floor in the boss's office, a strange transparent cloud begins to attack the village. It appears suddenly in front of him, and appendages start growing from it. These appendages keep multiplying every second and reach for the main character's stick, but the young man dodges and says his opponent is very fast. He has to jump quickly from place to place because his movements are sudden and sharp, and he realizes the monster attacks like a whip. The main character realizes that physical attacks don't affect this kind of monster, and his stick causes no damage. The man stares at the monster attacking him with a serious expression and says this is exactly the kind of reaction he expected from the maze. It's a pity such enemies only started appearing on the 15th floor. A second later, appendages pounced on the young man from all sides. Preparing for a serious fight, the main character easily deflects the monster's attacks while admitting he is still not as strong as him. When physical attacks fail, he turns to magic, rises into the air and casts a thundering rain spell, then clouds gather and lightning strikes the monster. The young man falls to the ground after that powerful attack. Seizing the haze as the lightning faded, he found no trace of the monster the attack had been aimed at. The young man watches the mist disperse and says the creature appears unprotected against lightning strikes. Eager and excited, the man digs through the monster-guarded chest, thinking tougher enemies mean better rewards, but the young man in the black cloak is disappointed to find seeds again, even though he is actually a farmer. While fighting the monsters on the 16th floor, the young man still complains about the poor rewards in the dungeon chests. Even on the 17th floor, the main character still cannot understand why the seeds are there, though he believes there is nothing wrong with them. Later, while fighting the creatures on the 18th floor, the young man still believes the chests create false hopes. On the 17th floor, he hoped that defeating a powerful enemy would net him some treasure because he wanted something useful for the winter. On the 20th floor, the monster turns out to be a multi-winged eagle, its furious gaze fixed on the man. Someone who challenges him hopes that this time he won't get seeds. He defends the maze and pours all his strength into it, but they only mock him. The hero tells the monster flying above him that he controls the lightning, so he tests whose lightning is stronger by casting the thunder rain spell. The next second, the sky darkens and sends lightning that strikes the eagle as it bends to dodge. The eagle rises to its full height, startling the young man as it reveals the power to absorb spells, then it lifts off glowing with sparks. On the 15th floor, a magical creature throws a lightsaber at the young man. Seeing him stand with his mouth open is impressive. The man rushes to raise a barrier, lifting his hands to cover one eye as the monster's spell strikes its shield, made of several parts for greater durability. When the spell's magic fades, the young man uses his other sorcery and asks his opponent what they think of him. A sphere of light forms in his open hand, with lightning arcing around it. The hero lifts both hands and tells the thunder dragon to accept his challenge, and the magic in his body begins to form a huge magical creature. The young man orders the dragon made of thunder sparks he just created to rush to attack the enemy. It obeys and flies fiercely toward the eagle. Summoned by the young man for protection, the dragon coils around his winged opponent and squeezes with all its strength, forcing a scream from the monster. The magical creature and its opponent crash to the ground, ripping the earth and leaving a small crater. A moment after the dragon nearly defeats the eagle by pinning it, the young man summons a stone chain that coils around the opponent's whole body. Standing on a small hill above his opponent, the man tells Tom that Tom will not escape him now. Atul thinks only the final blow remains, but a feather slowly falls from his right side and distracts him. The young man catches the falling feather by its tip and studies it, finding it interesting. The young man remembers the Goblin King dropped his crown on the 5th floor, and usually after a victory, the monster's body turns completely to dust while the eagle still has its feathers. After the fight, the main character carefully gathers the leftover wing and feather pieces from the bird he just fought and happily continues his journey. He realized that if he killed the boss instantly, everything on his body would disappear, but if the boss was weakened or an item was removed from him, it would not disappear after his death as happened with the feathers. Realizing this simple truth, the young man decided to go back because the previous floors were full of goblins, so he could kill them, harvest their fanged meat, and sell everything to the duchy. After a brief pause, a decent catch appears before the guy, made up of claws, fangs, feathers, and several pieces of meat. The young man wipes the sweat from his forehead. A moment later, he says he was able to collect as much as 100 kilograms of selected meat at a time. Now he knows how to fight monsters and earn rewards for himself. The protagonist says he is ready to forgive the maze if he sees the seeds there again, and remembering he is on the 16th floor, he decides to go back for his bee and head downstairs. A sudden loud noise like a scream interrupts the villagers' calm journey and startles them. Drawing on experience, the young man recognizes the scream echoing through the quiet thicket as human and runs toward where it came from. Bursting into the clearing where a battle rages, the man sees an armored knight fighting huge orcs and their small minions, with a cat-like girl lying beside him. After passing through the trees, the man sees a clearing where monsters and adventurers are fighting, and he is down to his last strength. The young man watches a group of adventurers fighting in front of him, but they have been badly defeated, and the last one still on his feet is already running out of strength. A second later, he turns to a girl with cat ears, who squints and stares blankly ahead, then asks who is in front of her. Putting on the fox mask he wore for the Merchant Guild a few days earlier, the main character feels his stealth has reached a new level but still activates his attribute. The girl lies on the ground, looking at the man with an exhausted expression, bruises under her eyes, and though she does not know who he is, she asks for help. The young man looks around, counts everyone, and concludes there are 4 people. 3 can no longer fight, and their leader can barely stand. The young man runs to help everyone, because if he does nothing, the trapped adventurers will remain in the maze forever and die. The main character rushes forward to defend a young man who can barely stand as the monsters close in on him. After a soul starts working his magic, summoning balls of lightning into his hand, the man he rushes to protect asks who he is. The thunder rain they had summoned earlier falls on the orcs and trolls as they are about to attack the young man, causing the monsters to roast in place. The blonde stranger, who nearly died, is stunned that his defender casts a spell without reading it, and the spell deals massive damage as the monsters begin to fall. The main character sees that after his sparkling attack, only one survivor remains, a red ogre rushing at him with extraordinary speed and a loud roar. Taking a fighting stance, he leans forward and says he used a fairly powerful spell, but the creature turned out to be much stronger than the others. It starts attacking the village. The man in the black cloak lifts his hand, begins a new spell, and tells the ogre he will show a new kind of lightning magic as a trident forms above his head. The young man shouts a spell that rings like a sparkling spear. Moving his hand, he points it at his huge opponent. The magic projectile flies straight at the opponent, hits him square in the center of the forehead, and knocks him out. The adventurers watched him openly stunned, because they had never seen mastery of magic this powerful before. A spear of sparkling lightning pierces a huge monster, knocking it onto its stomach and forcing it to drop a massive hammer, the impact sending a roar across the area. From a high vantage point, the main character watches everything and says the ogre held out a little longer but was still far from it, and the monsters from the sacred mountain were much stronger. 2 adventurers, unknown to the young man watching, say she is safe and relax now that the threat is gone. The blonde knight who tried to fight to the end covers his eyes, thanks the young man, says he is glad for his help whoever he is, and then turns to his teammates. Rushing to his unconscious friends, the stranger tells them to hold on and that the monsters have been defeated, so they can safely return to the surface. Seeing the scene, the main character realizes 3 of the 4 team members are barely breathing, and that the leader is too badly wounded to get everyone out, so he decides to help. The young man raises his hands again and chants a mass healing spell, and the 4 adventurers who fought the ogres begin to regain consciousness. The blonde-haired knight looks at his hands, once wounded, and says he's completely healed from the cuts, then turns his head and sees their savior begin running away briskly. The rescued man in armor starts to catch up with the village and asks him to stop and give his name so he knows who to thank for saving his team from the ogres. The main character pauses and realizes that if he doesn't answer, the man might chase him and his friends will wake up soon. The young man in the black cloak says his name is Ona. Immediately, he moves away from the people he saved and runs into the thick forest. The main character hears his new acquaintance thank him, explain they are part of a group called the Brilliant Wing, and say they will definitely repay him for his help in the future. Running off without looking back at his new acquaintances, he realized this had been his first meeting with the Brilliant Wing, the future famed elite group of C-ranked adventurers. Arriving on the 10th floor where he had left his pet earlier, he feels he has already done one good deed today, and since it is quite late, decides that is enough. The young man calls Quinn his pet bee, but a swarm of BS that resemble his insect flies to him. Stunned by the picture shown to him, the main character claims Quinn found a local nest of bees and defeated its leader, so people now see her as the new queen bee. The tool smiles shyly, glad that his pet will help him gather much more honey. A couple of weeks later, the main character returns to the duchy and comes to my house, where he decides to make a rocking chair for himself and completes it safely. The young man is glad he turned the feathers from the monster he defeated on the 15th floor of the maze into soft pillows and used them to make himself a chair. The hero believes this is the most comfortable thing to relax on and calls it wonderful. The pillow sits on the chair back and on the seat, providing maximum comfort. After returning from the maze, the soul discovered the multi-winged bird he had defeated was a thunder eagle, a high-ranking monster whose feathers and meat are highly valued on the market. Satisfied and comfortable, the young man figures the chair took about a week to design and build and believes it was worth it because he can sell it for a profit. Before developing a patent, the main character decides he must clean up the mess he made while designing a new piece of furniture for himself. The guy looks around the room and says that, honestly, it's hard to live alone in a house like this, and even if he cleans up, the mess comes back. The young man claps his hands, joy in his eyes, because he decided he would just hire someone and is thinking about a housekeeper. To carry out his plans and make sure his decision was correct, he knows he needs the advice of someone knowledgeable. After some time, the village has gathered at a friend's house, and one man asks another for help, while Mr. Lebrant eagerly inspects the rocking chair he invented. A man rocks in an armchair and says the main character reinvented something amazing. The chair is comfortable and the rocking is soothing. He'd love one for his home. His friend leans in and says he will gladly pay for this miracle. The other man says he understands, but asks to return to the topic, and Mr. Lebrant says a young man should buy the housekeeper rather than hire her, which surprises the young man. The man says a young man needs to buy a slave to meet all his needs, both for daily life and when traveling. This will be especially important to him, since the village itself behaves like a private person and keeps many things secret from others. A slave has no right to oppose his master and exists only for household duties. The main character knew slavery was common in the world he ended up in after being reborn as a resident of Japan, but he never even considered buying a slave. Mr. Leblanc says this is the best option for the young man, and since he is a minor, an adult will be his guarantor for the purchase. The young man thanks him. His friend's words make the young man realize that if he starts doing household chores, no one will be left to make new items for the friend's trading house, so it is much easier for a man to help him. The protagonist and his old friend approach a 3-story building that houses a shop run by the capital's top slaver. Mr. Lebrant says he told the owner about the young man's visit, so the young man should just tell the owner his preferences, and the owner will choose the right one for him, and the boy thanks Mr. Lebrant. Set up by a friend, a young man is finally dating the man recommended to him and asks about the purpose of the visit, while clarifying the requirements he expects from his future servant. The man says he has minimum requirements. The slave must be able to do housework, and since he plans to start a career as an adventurer, an ambitious companion would be useful. Embarrassed, the young man puts his hand to his face and says he wants a man about his age, preferably female. The house owner writes down all the requirements so nothing is missed later. According to the new equations, he understood everything and did not know whether his friend had told the young man, but they do not enslave people who lost a bet, have no pedigree, and are of bad character, so the young man can be calm. The shopkeeper leads the protagonist onto a makeshift stage and says he will present each candidate according to the visitor's criteria. The visitor on the trading floor is a little nervous. 7 girls stand before a young man, 5 of them human and the others a dog man and a cat man, and he hears their names, ages, and special skills before making a final assessment. The owner asks Mr. Attal what he thinks of the girls he saw. If he likes someone, he can speak with her privately. Mr. Attal says he wants to speak with 3 slaves. Slave number 4 is invited into the conversation first. The man introduces himself and says his name, and the girl thanks him for allowing a private conversation with the young man. The main character says he wants to find someone who will take care of the household chores and later won't be afraid to become an adventurer and go with him into the maze. Apologizing, the girl says the hero is probably wondering why she is missing her right eye and left hand. It does not affect her duties, and she is ready to become an adventurer. Pleased that she is determined, he says he is only 10 years old, hopes she won't be embarrassed by his age, and plans to enter the Magic Academy this spring, so he will be quite busy. Slave number 4 says she sees no problem with the young man's age and graduated from the Magic Academy, so she can help him study there. Closing his eyes, the young man decides the girl has lost a lot, but she is clearly talented. With her help, he can easily enter the academy. Slave number 6, Maroon, volunteered next to speak and immediately asked about Mr. Assul's origin, leaving the young man in a stupor. Realizing the girl mistook him for a nobleman, he says he's an ordinary commoner, doesn't blame the dogman for her mistake, and feels he has disappointed her a little. Slave number 7 is named Yomi. She promises she's ready to handle all the household responsibilities and to accompany the main character on his adventures. If he buys her, he won't regret it for a second. The young man finds the girl truly attractive, tells her he is an ordinary commoner, and asks if she minds, and she says she will serve him even though she is not his servant. After meeting the last applicant, the young man concludes that she has exceptional abilities, is a good person, and that he has no hidden intentions toward her. The store owner approaches the hero from behind and asks who he'll choose, and the hero, embarrassed, says he has already decided. After a moment, a soul says he will buy the 4th and 7th slaves because they like him more than the others for their qualities. After a brief maneuver, the shop owner says the deal with the slave master is complete. Now the main character is the rightful owner of the 2 girls. The young man and his 2 companions walk down the shopping streets, with shops selling a variety of goods on both sides, heading toward his house. While walking, the young man is upset that he bought the slaves and now has no idea how to handle them. Two girls walking a little behind suddenly approach the main character and ask if he is okay because he has been prostrate for too long. Shouting that he's fine, the young man thinks he must get ready because you can't undo what you've done, and he has already become their master, so they will cope. A man leads them to his two-story mansion and tells them they have arrived. He asks the two new girls to make themselves at home in his modest estate. The slaves cannot stop admiring how beautiful their new home is. When a 10-year-old boy and his new maids enter the living room he is proud of, he steps forward and asks the strangers to introduce themselves again. Bowing carefully with his eyes closed, he says his name is Sewall, and his respectful manner surprises the girls who are not used to it. A slave missing an eye and an arm tells him the young man should not show them too much respect because others may criticize him. He explains he didn't know about this because he never had a special aristocratic education, then politely asks them to introduce themselves again. Slave number 4 says she has no name, so the young man can call her whatever he likes, and she is skilled at household chores and fencing. Slave number 7 gives her name as Yomi and can perform household chores, handle surveillance tasks, and use a dagger. The last girl grins and confidently says she is good at adult pleasures, and a second later he says he can show his skills tonight. The first slave steps into the conversation, embarrassed, and shouts that she won't let her friend do any indecent things with the master while she's here. Watching the argument between the girls he has to live with for a long time, the young man feels embarrassed as he realizes they will probably get along well. The young man thinks of a name for a blonde slave, notices her hair shining in the moonlight, and chooses the name Moon. After deciding, the main character tells slave number 4 that her name will be Luna, asks if she is okay with it, and his companion feels slightly embarrassed. Smiling through tears, the girl says she is truly moved to finally have such a beautiful name. The tool is surprised that Luna cried so hard at the new name, and he knows she had a difficult time before. He laughs softly, then suggests discussing the details of their future collaboration over dinner. The girls set the table for their master and left the young man dazed by sitting at his feet and on his knees, and he closes his eyes and looks attentively at his maids. Confused, the main character asks his slaves what they are doing, and the blonde woman replies that they are glad to sit on the leftovers of his meal because he prepared so much, which she finds unsurprising since his body is young. Smiling, the young man realizes he has encountered this world's oddities again and tells them he set the table for his maids too because he decided to celebrate their first dinner together. At first, the girls are so surprised their mouths drop open. Then the brown-haired girl jumps up and says she doesn't dare refuse since the owner prepared the food. Both slaves sit at the table, but Luna hesitates because she wasn't taught that way. Yomi doesn't see why Luna should refuse when their new owner chose to pamper the heroines today. At the first bites of the festive dinner, the girls break into embarrassed smiles and say they haven't had such delicious food in a long time, unable to hide their delight. While the slaves eat, the man explains why he bought them, saying he has many secrets so he won't hire servants and needs the house kept clean. They say the young man is still around. At the first meeting, he said he would visit the maze from time to time and wanted to take them with him. He plans to attend the Magic Academy in the spring and would welcome their help with admission. Luda asks what secrets the guy is keeping and whether girls are allowed to know them since he mentioned them recently.